Hey guys, welcome back. Today, we're diving into some of the most chilling and disturbing stories from the world of organized crime. From ruthless mobsters to violent hitmen, these are the tales that go beyond what you see in movies. These real-life mafia stories expose the dark underbelly of the criminal world, where betrayal, murder, and power struggles are commonplace. So sit back, relax, and prepare yourself for some of the most twisted mafia stories in history. But remember, this is no Hollywood fiction. It's the grim reality that shaped the mafia as we know it. John Gotti, one of the most notorious figures in the history of the Gambino crime family, was not just a mob boss. He became a symbol of the power and influence that organized crime could wield in American society. His rise to power was both strategic and ruthless, and his ability to escape conviction through witness intimidation and the corruption of law enforcement officials earned him the nickname the Teflon Don. Gotti's story begins in the gritty streets of Brooklyn, where he grew up surrounded by violence, crime, and the underworld culture that would eventually swallow him whole. John Gotti's first encounter with the mafia came when he joined the Gambino family in the early 1970s, quickly making a name for himself through his violent acts and cunning manipulations. He worked his way up through the ranks, eventually becoming the right-hand man of Paul Castellano, the boss of the Gambino family. However, Gotti's ambition and lust for power soon led to a deadly confrontation with Castellano. In 1985, Castellano was assassinated outside a Manhattan steakhouse, with Gotti and his associates believed to be the masterminds of the hit. With Castellano out of the way, Gotti took over the reins of the Gambino family, cementing his status as one of the most feared and powerful figures in the American mafia. Under Gotti's leadership, the Gambino family became more notorious than ever before, dominating New York's criminal underworld. His operations included drug trafficking, loan sharking, extortion, and murder, but it was his manipulation of the legal system that truly set him apart. Gotti used his public persona as a man of the people, a charming and well-dressed figure who had the media eating out of his hands. He became known for his ability to charm juries, and his escapes from conviction made him a legend in the underworld. He was acquitted in multiple high-profile trials, often through the use of witness intimidation, bribery, and tampering with evidence. His Teflon Don nickname came from his uncanny ability to avoid being caught or convicted for his crimes, despite overwhelming evidence against him. However, Gotti's reign was not without its rivals. His violent methods and the public nature of his power grab led to tensions with other crime families, both within the five families of New York and beyond. Salvatore, Sammy the Bull, Gravano, Gotti's underboss, was one of the most prominent figures in the Gambino family's operations. But in a stunning act of betrayal, Gravano turned state's witness against Gotti in 1991, testifying that Gotti had ordered the murder of Castellano and had orchestrated a number of other crimes. This was a major blow to Gotti, who had prided himself on his loyalty to his men and his ability to keep his associates in line. In 1992, Gotti was finally convicted on charges of murder, racketeering, and conspiracy following Gravano's testimony. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Despite his conviction, Gotti's legend lived on, and his death in 2002 in prison from cancer did little to diminish his legacy as one of the most infamous and powerful figures in the history of organized crime. Gotti's story serves as a stark reminder of the corrupting influence of power and the price of loyalty in the world of the mafia. He went from being a man who appeared untouchable by the law to one who died behind bars, his criminal empire reduced to a memory. Yet in death, Gotti remains a symbol of the seductive allure and inevitable downfall of those who seek to control the underworld. The murder of Paul Castellano, the boss of the Gambino crime family, stands as one of the most iconic moments in mafia history. The hit was not just a typical mob killing. It was the bloody culmination of power struggles, betrayal, and ambition that defined the rise of one of the most infamous mafia bosses in America, John Gotti. Castellano's assassination not only rocked the mafia world, but also marked a shift in the Gambino family's leadership and a significant turning point in the American criminal underworld. Paul Castellano, who became the head of the Gambino family in 1976, was known for his cold and calculated leadership style, which contrasted with the more flamboyant and aggressive nature of his predecessor, Carlo Gambino. Under Castellano, the Gambino family continued to grow its influence in New York, expanding into construction rackets, loan sharking, and drug trafficking. Castellano, however, was increasingly seen as a figure more interested in legitimate business dealings and wealth accumulation than in traditional mafia activities like street-level violence. This earned him the disapproval of several family members, including John Gotti, who felt Castellano was out of touch with the more traditional violent nature of the mob. Gotti, who had risen through the ranks of the Gambino family through violence and cunning, grew increasingly frustrated with Castellano's leadership. In particular, Castellano's decision to exclude key family members, including Gotti, from major criminal decisions caused resentment. Gotti believed that Castellano, who had become more involved in legitimate business dealings and less focused on the mafia's traditional activities, was weakening the family's grip on power. It was during this period of growing tension that Gotti, along with several of his close associates, decided to take action. The decision to have Castellano killed was not taken lightly. In the mob world, the murder of a boss is a rare event, and it typically signals a violent shift in the balance of power. However, Gotti, who had been considered one of Castellano's closest allies, believed that removing him would be the only way to secure control of the Gambino family and restore its dominance in the criminal world. The plot was set into motion, and on December 16, 1985, Castellano was gunned down in front of Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan, a move that would send shockwaves throughout the underworld. The hit was carried out with military precision as Castellano and his bodyguard were ambushed by several shooters waiting outside the restaurant. Castellano, who had been in the car with his bodyguard, was shot multiple times and both men were left for dead. It was a classic mob hit, quick, efficient, and brutal. The murder sent a message to the rest of the mafia world that no one was untouchable, not even the boss of the most powerful crime family in New York. The repercussions of Castellano's murder were immediate and profound. Gotti's rise to power was swift, as he assumed leadership of the Gambino family just days after Castellano's death. However, his ascension was not without its challenges. The murder of a boss, especially one as high-profile as Castellano, invited scrutiny from law enforcement and rival mob families. Despite the attention surrounding the hit, Gotti was able to maintain control of the family through a combination of violence, manipulation, and his reputation as a leader who could not be easily toppled. While Gotti's rise was facilitated by the murder of Castellano, it was not without consequences. The Gambino family was left reeling from the loss of its boss, and Gotti had to navigate the delicate politics of maintaining power while dealing with the fallout of the assassination. Gotti's actions earned him the hatred of several mafia members, and his reign would be marked by ongoing conflict within the family and with other organized crime groups. The murder of Castellano, while a victory for Gotti marked a pivotal moment in the history of the Gambino family and the mafia as a whole. It symbolized the violent, unpredictable nature of organized crime and the constant power struggles that characterized the mafia world. For Gotti, the murder secured his place as one of the most notorious mob bosses in American history, but it also set him on a path that would ultimately lead to his downfall. The story of Paul Castellano's murder serves as a reminder of the brutality and treachery that define the mafia. While it may have been a necessary act of violence for Gotti to assume power, it also illustrates the constant danger and instability that come with leading an organized crime family. For Gotti, the murder of Castellano marked the beginning of his reign, but it also set in motion a chain of events that would eventually lead to his conviction and life sentence. In the mafia world, power comes at a steep price, and no one knows this better than John Gotti. In the world of organized crime, betrayal is often the most dangerous currency. Sammy "the Bull" Gravano, once the right-hand man of John Gotti, became infamous not for his role in the Gambino crime family, but for his shocking decision to testify against his former boss, leading to Gotti's conviction. Gravano's betrayal would mark one of the most significant moments in the history of the mafia, and his story is a testament to the ruthlessness and treachery that define the underworld. Sammy Gravano was born into a life of crime. Growing up in Brooklyn, he was drawn into the mafia world at a young age, eventually joining the Gambino family in the 1970s. Gravano's rise was swift. Known for his violent nature, he quickly became involved in major criminal activities, including drug trafficking, murder, and racketeering. He was a key player in the Gambino family's operations and was known for his efficiency and cold-bloodedness. Gravano was responsible for overseeing the family's operations in Brooklyn and was heavily involved in the Gotti family's rise to power. Gravano's relationship with John Gotti was one of mutual respect and loyalty. Gotti, who became the boss of the Gambino family in 1985 after the assassination of Paul Castellano, valued Gravano's ruthless efficiency and his to handle difficult tasks. Gravano was promoted to the position of underboss, making him second in command of the Gambino family. Under Gotti's leadership, the family grew even more powerful, dominating New York's criminal underworld. Gravano played a significant role in this expansion, earning a reputation as one of the most feared mobsters in the country. However, the bond between Gotti and Gravano would eventually fracture. The problem started when Gotti became increasingly obsessed with his public image. He wanted to be seen as the untouchable mafia boss, the Teflon Don, and he began to rely more on public relations and charm rather than the traditional methods of running the family. Gravano, who had been a more behind-the-scenes figure, grew frustrated with Gotti's decisions, especially as Gotti's focus shifted toward media attention and distancing himself from the dirty work that had always been the backbone of mafia power. The breaking point came when Gotti was put on trial for the murder of Paul Castellano and other charges in the late 1980s. Despite Gotti's previous ability to evade conviction, this trial was different. Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, who had played a pivotal role in some of the family's most heinous acts, was facing his own legal battles. Gravano had been arrested for his involvement in the drug trade, and it was clear that his involvement in the criminal world would land him in prison for a long time unless he cooperated with law enforcement. In a shocking move, Gravano turned on his former boss. In 1991, Gravano agreed to cooperate with the US government and testified against John Gotti in exchange for a reduced sentence. This was one of the most dramatic betrayals in mafia history, as Gravano, who had once been Gotti's closest ally, became the government's key witness. His testimony was instrumental in securing Gotti's conviction, and the Teflon Don, who had avoided multiple convictions, was finally sent to prison for life. Gravano's decision to testify was seen as a betrayal of the highest order. In the world of the mafia, loyalty is sacred, and turning on a fellow mobster, especially a boss, is considered unforgivable. Gravano's cooperation led to the conviction of not only Gotti, but also several other members of the Gambino family. The government used Gravano's testimony to dismantle key parts of the family's operations. Gotti's life sentence marked the end of his reign, and Gravano's actions were pivotal in his downfall. While Gravano was lauded for his cooperation with the government, his actions did not come without consequences. After serving just 5 years in prison for his role in the mafia, he was released in 1995. Despite his cooperation with the government, Gravano was shunned by many in the criminal world. The mob code of silence, or omerta, dictated that betrayal of a fellow member was one of the most egregious offences. For many, Gravano's actions marked the ultimate dishonor. His role in Gotti's conviction made him a pariah in the mafia world. After his release from prison, Gravano attempted to live a quieter life. He moved to Arizona, where he ran a construction business, but his past would never leave him. In 2000, Gravano was arrested again for his involvement in a drug trafficking operation. His second conviction led to another lengthy sentence, and he was sent to federal prison once more. Despite his cooperation with authorities, Gravano's criminal life never truly ended, as his past continued to haunt him. Gravano's story is a powerful example of how loyalty and betrayal shape the world of organized crime. His rise to power in the Gambino family was marked by violence, cunning, and ambition, and his betrayal of John Gotti was one of the most significant moments in mafia history. Gravano's decision to turn on his boss not only altered the course of his life, but also sent shockwaves through the mafia world. His story serves as a reminder of the brutal, unforgiving nature of the criminal underworld, where alliances can shift in an instant, and betrayal can come from the unlikeliest of sources. In the world of organized crime, betrayal is often the most dangerous currency. Sammy the Bull Gravano, once the right-hand man of John Gotti, became infamous not for his role in the Gambino crime family, but for his shocking decision to testify against his former boss, leading to Gotti's conviction. Gravano's betrayal would mark one of the most significant moments in the history of the mafia, and his story is a testament to the ruthlessness and treachery that define the underworld. Sammy Gravano was born into a life of crime. Growing up in Brooklyn, he was drawn into the mafia world at a young age, eventually joining the Gambino family in the 1970s. Gravano's rise was swift. Known for his violent nature, he quickly became involved in major criminal activities, including drug trafficking, murder, and racketeering. He was a key player in the Gambino family's operations and was known for his efficiency and cold-bloodedness. Gravano was responsible for overseeing the family's operations in Brooklyn and was heavily involved in the Gotti family's rise to power. Gravano's relationship with John Gotti was one of mutual respect and loyalty. Gotti, who became the boss of the Gambino family in 1985 after the assassination of Paul Castellano, valued Gravano's ruthless efficiency and his to handle difficult tasks. Gravano was promoted to the position of underboss, making him second in command of the Gambino family. Under Gotti's leadership, the family grew even more powerful, dominating New York's criminal underworld. Gravano played a significant role in this expansion, earning a reputation as one of the most feared mobsters in the country. However, the bond between Gotti and Gravano would eventually fracture. The problem started when Gotti became increasingly obsessed with his public image. He wanted to be seen as the untouchable mafia boss, the Teflon Don, and he began to rely more on public relations and charm rather than the traditional methods of running the family. Gravano, who had been a more behind-the-scenes figure, grew frustrated with Gotti's decisions, especially as Gotti's focus shifted toward media attention and distancing himself from the dirty work that had always been the backbone of mafia power. The breaking point came when Gotti was put on trial for the murder of Paul Castellano and other charges in the late 1980s. Despite Gotti's previous ability to evade conviction, this trial was different. Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, who had played a pivotal role in some of the family's most heinous acts, was facing his own legal battles. Gravano had been arrested for his involvement in the drug trade, and it was clear that his involvement in the criminal world would land him in prison for a long time unless he cooperated with law enforcement. In a shocking move, Gravano turned on his former boss. In 1991, Gravano agreed to cooperate with the US government and testified against John Gotti in exchange for a reduced sentence. This was one of the most dramatic betrayals in mafia history, as Gravano, who had once been Gotti's closest ally, became the government's key witness. His testimony was instrumental in securing Gotti's conviction, and the Teflon Don, who had avoided multiple convictions, was finally sent to prison for life. Gravano's decision to testify was seen as a betrayal of the highest order. In the world of the mafia, loyalty is sacred, and turning on a fellow mobster, especially a boss, is considered unforgivable. Gravano's cooperation led to the conviction of not only Gotti, but also several other members of the Gambino family. The government used Gravano's testimony to dismantle key parts of the family's operations. Gotti's life sentence marked the end of his reign, and Gravano's actions were pivotal in his downfall. While Gravano was lauded for his cooperation with the government, his actions did not come without consequences. After serving just 5 years in prison for his role in the mafia, he was released in 1995. Despite his cooperation with the government, Gravano was shunned by many in the criminal world. The mob code of silence, or omerta, dictated that betrayal of a fellow member was one of the most egregious offences. For many, Gravano's actions marked the ultimate dishonor. His role in Gotti's conviction made him a pariah in the mafia world. After his release from prison, Gravano attempted to live a quieter life. He moved to Arizona, where he ran a construction business. But his past would never leave him. In 2000, Gravano was arrested again for his involvement in a drug trafficking operation. His second conviction led to another lengthy sentence, and he was sent to federal prison once more. Despite his cooperation with authorities, Gravano's criminal life never truly ended, as his past continued to haunt him. Gravano's story is a powerful example of how loyalty and betrayal shaped the world of organized crime. His rise to power in the Gambino family was marked by violence, cunning, and ambition, and his betrayal of John Gotti was one of the most significant moments in mafia history. Gravano's decision to turn on his boss not only altered the course of his life, but also sent shockwaves through the mafia world. His story serves as a reminder of the brutal, unforgiving nature of the criminal underworld, where alliances can shift in an instant, and betrayal can come from the unlikeliest of sources. Chapter 4 will continue with another mafia story, exploring the life and downfall of a notorious mobster. Let me know if you'd like to proceed with the next chapters. You said P. ChatGPT said Chapter 4, the story of Whitey Bulger, the infamous mobster and FBI informant. James Whitey Bulger once one of the most feared mobsters in Boston, became notorious not only for his role in the criminal underworld, but for his unexpected status as an FBI informant. His life was marked by betrayal, violence, and manipulation, making him one of the most controversial figures in mafia history. Bulger's story is a chilling example of the blurred lines between law enforcement and organized crime, as well as the consequences of crossing those lines. Born in 1929 in Boston's South Boston neighborhood, Bulger grew up in a working-class Irish family, and like many young men in his community, he was drawn to a life of crime. He quickly became involved in petty theft and extortion, but it wasn't long before he rose through the ranks of the Winter Hill Gang, a criminal organization that controlled much of the illegal activity in Boston. By the 1970s, Bulger had become one of the most powerful figures in the city's underworld, with a reputation for ruthlessness and a knack for avoiding the law. What made Bulger's rise to power even more remarkable was his relationship with the FBI. In a stunning twist, Bulger became an informant for the FBI's John Connolly, who was tasked with infiltrating the Patriarca crime family. In exchange for information about rival criminal organizations, Bulger was allowed to continue his own illicit activities, including drug trafficking, racketeering, and murder, all while operating with relative immunity from prosecution. This arrangement turned Bulger into a double agent, feeding the FBI information while simultaneously building his criminal empire. His cooperation with the FBI allowed him to consolidate power, eliminate his rivals, and continue operating without fear of arrest. But Bulger's relationship with the FBI was far from one of mutual trust. While he worked as an informant, he was also playing a dangerous game, using the protection of law enforcement to further his criminal enterprises. His connection with Connolly allowed him to gather intelligence on investigations into his own activities, giving him a significant edge over law enforcement. In many ways, Bulger had become untouchable, and he knew it. This deadly alliance between the FBI and one of Boston's most notorious criminals would eventually come back to haunt both Bulger and the agency. As Bulger's power grew, so did his brutality. He was suspected of being involved in the murders of at least 19 people, though the true number remains unknown. Bulger's method of dealing with rivals was swift and violent, and he used a network of loyal henchmen to carry out his dirty work. He had a reputation for torture and execution-style killings, often eliminating those who were perceived as threats to his empire. His criminal activities weren't limited to Boston, as he was deeply involved in drug trafficking, extortion, and the illegal gambling industry across the East Coast. Despite his violent nature, Bulger maintained a careful public image. He was known for his charm and charisma, often blending into his community and even becoming a folk hero in South Boston. The local residents, many of whom admired his power and influence, saw him as a protector of their neighborhood. Bulger's ability to keep a low profile while running a ruthless criminal operation made him a difficult figure to track, and for decades he evaded law enforcement's grasp. However, Bulger's life took a dramatic turn in 1994 when he was tipped off about an impending indictment for murder and racketeering. The very people who had protected him, FBI agents, warned him that he was about to be arrested. In a move that stunned even his closest associates, Bulger went into hiding, disappearing without a trace. For the next 16 years, Bulger lived as one of the most wanted fugitives in the world, slipping in and out of various locations across the US and abroad. Bulger's disappearance marked the beginning of an intense manhunt by the FBI. For over a decade, law enforcement officers searched for him, following leads across the world. He was featured on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list, and was the subject of numerous investigations, but he managed to evade capture, hiding under false identities and living in relative obscurity. It wasn't until 2011 that Bulger's luck ran out. After years of evading capture, he was finally arrested in Santa Monica, California, living in a $1,150 per month apartment with his longtime companion, Catherine Greig. The arrest was a major victory for the FBI, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about the agency's role in protecting Bulger and allowing him to operate for so many years. Bulger's trial in 2013 was one of the most high-profile cases in recent U.S. history. He was charged with 11 murders, racketeering, and a variety of other crimes related to his criminal empire. His former associates testified against him, and the trial revealed the full extent of his brutal reign. Bulger's defense was that he was acting as an informant for the FBI, but the jury was not swayed. He was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to 2 life terms in prison. While serving his sentence, Bulger's story took another shocking turn. In 2018, at the age of 89, Bulger was killed in prison, allegedly by fellow inmates who were seeking revenge for his role in implicating other criminals and for his cooperation with the FBI. His murder highlighted the deep animosity that existed between Bulger and the criminal world, a world that had once feared and revered him. The story of Whitey Bulger is a chilling reminder of the corruption and moral ambiguity within law enforcement and organized crime. His ability to manipulate both the mafia and the FBI allowed him to maintain his criminal empire for years, and his betrayal of both sides made him one of the most controversial figures in American criminal history. Bulger's life and eventual death illustrate the dangers of power and loyalty in the criminal underworld, where betrayal can come from the most unexpected places and where no one, not even the most feared mobsters, is truly untouchable. Alphonse Gabriel Al Capone, one of the most infamous figures in American mafia history, is often seen as the face of organized crime during the Prohibition era. Capone's name is synonymous with crime, violence, and the rise of the Chicago Outfit, the criminal organization he led in the 1920s and early 1930s. Despite being involved in everything from bootlegging to murder, Capone managed to build an empire worth millions while evading the law, until one of the most famous downfalls in mafia history occurred. Born in Brooklyn, New York, in 1899 to immigrant parents, Capone grew up in the rough neighborhoods of the city. He became involved in small-time crime at an early age, working under Johnny Torrio, a key figure in the Chicago Mafia. When Torrio was forced to return to Italy after a failed assassination attempt in 1925, Capone seized control of the operation, eventually transforming it into one of the most powerful and violent crime syndicates in America. His success was built on his ability to take over the illegal alcohol trade, which had skyrocketed during Prohibition, a nationwide ban on alcohol that started in 1920. Capone's rise to power in Chicago was marked by ruthless violence. He quickly eliminated any competitors through murder and intimidation, consolidating his power and expanding his influence across the city. His criminal empire extended far beyond bootlegging and included gambling, prostitution, and extortion. Capone became a public figure, charming politicians, businessmen, and the public with his charisma while secretly running a criminal empire. His ability to mix with society's elite while simultaneously running a network of violence made him appear untouchable, and many believed that no one could challenge his position. One of Capone's most famous actions during his reign was his involvement in the St. Valentine's Day massacre in 1929. In an effort to eliminate his rival, George "Bugs" Moran, Capone's men dressed as police officers and gunned down 7 members of Moran's gang in a Chicago garage. The massacre shocked the nation and cemented Capone's reputation as a ruthless mob boss. Although Capone was suspected of orchestrating the massacre, he managed to avoid any legal repercussions, with many of the key witnesses refusing to testify due to fear of retaliation. Capone's reign, however, was not without its challenges. His violent actions, combined with his public persona, drew the attention of law enforcement. Despite being suspected of numerous murders and crimes, Capone's ability to bribe local police and politicians allowed him to evade prosecution for years. His downfall came not from his criminal activities, but from his failure to cover his tracks and his increasing arrogance in the face of rising public pressure to bring him to justice. Capone's eventual arrest came not from any of his numerous murders or other crimes, but from tax evasion. In the 1920s and 1930s, the IRS, Internal Revenue Service, became increasingly effective at going after organized crime figures, and Capone's lavish lifestyle and inability to hide his income made him a prime target. After a lengthy investigation, Capone was convicted of income tax evasion in 1931 and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, a punishment that also included fines and restitution. Capone's time in prison marked the beginning of the end for his once great empire. He was sent to Alcatraz, a maximum security prison on an island off the coast of California, where his health began to deteriorate rapidly. By the time he was imprisoned, Capone was suffering from syphilis, a disease that had plagued him for years. His time in prison, combined with his deteriorating health, caused his once sharp mind and formidable criminal abilities to fade. Despite his declining health, Capone maintained a presence in the criminal world from prison, with his associates still running parts of his empire. However, his influence waned as he struggled with his health problems and mental decline. Capone was eventually released from prison in 1939 after serving just 7 years, primarily due to his failing health. By this point, Capone was a shadow of his former self, no longer the powerful and ruthless mob boss he had once been. He spent his final years in seclusion, battling the effects of syphilis and trying to recover some semblance of his past life. Capone's legacy is one of both infamy and tragedy. While he remains a symbol of the Prohibition era and the Mafia's dominance in early 20th century America, his downfall illustrates the dangers of unchecked power, arrogance, and corruption. Capone's empire crumbled, not due to law enforcement's ability to bring him down through traditional methods, but because of his own overconfidence and inability to keep his criminal activities hidden. His story serves as a warning to those who operate outside the law, reminding us that the rise to power in the criminal world is often followed by a dramatic and irreversible fall. Capone died in 1947 at the age of 48 from complications related to stroke and pneumonia. He died alone in his Florida home, a far cry from the powerful and feared man he once was. The life of Al Capone remains one of the most fascinating and tragic in mafia history. His name still evokes images of the criminal underworld, and his story continues to captivate audiences worldwide. Thomas "Tommy the Knife" Lucchese was one of the most influential mobsters of the American Mafia, known not just for his brutality, but also for his shrewd business acumen. As the boss of the Lucchese crime family, he was responsible for running one of the 5 families of New York. While lesser known than figures like John Gotti or Lucky Luciano, Lucchese's ability to build and maintain an organized crime empire earned him respect and fear in equal measure within the criminal world. His story is a chilling reminder of how power and violence can intertwine, creating a legacy that impacts the criminal world long after death. Lucchese was born in 1902 in Sicily, and like many immigrants at the time, he sought a better life in the US. He moved to New York in the early 19th century, where he quickly became involved in the burgeoning world of organized crime. Initially, Lucchese worked as an enforcer, someone who made sure the family's orders were carried out through violence and intimidation. He was known for his cold efficiency, earning him the nickname Tommy the Knife due to his use of blades and knives in the execution of hits. Lucchese's rise to power was marked by his ability to blend seamlessly into the world of organized crime, while also maintaining a relatively low profile. While the more flamboyant figures in the mafia attracted the media's attention, Lucchese was known for operating in the shadows, making calculated moves that ensured his family's influence and wealth. His intelligence and discretion helped him avoid the scrutiny that other, more ostentatious bosses faced. His ambition, however, was never in question. In the 1930s, Lucchese's loyalty and business savvy caught the attention of Lucky Luciano, the boss of the powerful Genovese family. Luciano, a major figure in the reshaping of the mafia during the Prohibition era, recognized Lucchese's potential and took him under his wing. Under Luciano's guidance, Lucchese rose through the ranks of the Lucchese family, formerly known as the Galliano crime family, and began to develop a reputation as one of the most capable and discreet members of the mafia. By the mid-1940s, Lucchese had become the head of the crime family after the death of Galliano and the eventual incarceration of his predecessor. Lucchese's leadership marked a period of steady growth for the family. While he wasn't as publicly flashy as other mob bosses, he built his empire with strategic alliances, careful planning, and a well-structured system of loyal associates. His family became deeply involved in a wide range of criminal enterprises, from extortion and loan sharking to labor racketeering and drug trafficking. One of Lucchese's most significant contributions to the mafia was his role in creating the National Crime Syndicate, a network of organized crime families that spanned the United States. The syndicate helped to unify various mob families, allowing for a more coordinated effort in controlling the nation's criminal enterprises. Lucchese's family became one of the most powerful in the city, working closely with the other families while maintaining its autonomy and influence. Despite his status as a mob boss, Lucchese wasn't immune to the dangers of mafia life. He faced numerous attempts on his life from rivals, and his family was often at odds with others in the criminal world. However, his ability to negotiate and make peace allowed him to keep his family out of the worst conflicts. His leadership was marked by a balance between violence and diplomacy, making him a formidable force in the underworld. Lucchese's criminal activities weren't limited to the mafia. His ties to the American labor movement were especially notable. He became heavily involved in union racketeering, using his control over labor unions to extort money from legitimate businesses and enforce mafia interests within the unions. Lucchese's family controlled several unions, including those involved in construction and garbage collection, industries that would prove highly profitable for the mob. He also had strong connections to politicians and businessmen, using bribery and influence to keep the family's operations running smoothly. However, by the 1960s, Lucchese's health began to deteriorate. He was diagnosed with cancer, and in 1967 he died in Miami at the age of 65. His death marked the end of an era for the Lucchese crime family, but his legacy continued to influence the mafia for decades. Lucchese's underboss, Anthony "Tony Ducks" Corallo, took over leadership of the family and continued his business dealings, though the family's operations were significantly weakened in the years following Lucchese's death. Lucchesi's life story is one of careful ambition and ruthless efficiency. He may not have been as flamboyant or as notorious as other mafia bosses, but his impact on the world of organized crime was undeniable. Through his strategic planning and leadership, the Lucchese crime family became one of the most powerful and respected families in the mafia world. His role in shaping the modern American mafia and his involvement in the syndicate made him a key figure in the criminal world for much of the 20th century. The fall of the Lucchese family after his death is a reminder of the fragility of power in the criminal world. The loss of their patriarch left a void that would be difficult to fill, and over time the family became embroiled in conflicts with rival factions. However, Lucchesi's ability to maintain control, even in the face of death, solidified his place in mafia history as one of the most effective and dangerous mobsters of his time. Joe Gallo, known as Crazy Joe, became one of the most infamous figures in the New York Mafia for his defiance of the Colombo crime family and his dramatic end. His life was a mixture of violent ambition, betrayal, and a quest for power within the ranks of the mafia. What set Gallo apart from many of his contemporaries was his willingness to challenge authority and take on the established power structures of the mob, leading to his ultimate downfall in a blaze of violence. Joe Gallo was born in Brooklyn in 1929 and quickly became immersed in the criminal world. He started his career as a street thug, involved in petty crimes and later working his way up the ranks of the Colombo family. By the 1950s, Gallo was known as a violent and unpredictable figure, often acting on his emotions and rarely hesitating to use force. His nickname, Crazy Joe, reflected his erratic behavior and his willingness to act impulsively, even when it endangered his own life and the lives of those around him. Gallo's rise within the Colombo family came at a time when the mafia was in a period of transition. The Colombo family was one of the 5 major mafia families in New York, but it had its share of internal strife, especially under the leadership of Joseph Colombo, the family boss. Colombo had initially been a rising star in the family, but as his power grew, so did the tension with other members of the family. Gallo, who had a deep resentment for Colombo, saw an opportunity to make a move. He believed that Colombo's leadership was weak and that the family was stagnating under his rule. In the early 1970s, Gallo and a faction of the Colombo family, including his brothers, began to organize their own attempts to seize power. Gallo's ambition was obvious. He was determined to become a major force in the New York Mafia. He was not content with being a mere foot soldier in the organization. Gallo's faction openly clashed with Colombo's, leading to a series of violent confrontations. One of the most significant of these was Gallo's attempt to assassinate Colombo during a rally in 1971, where the family boss was shot but survived. Though Gallo's plot failed, it marked the beginning of a brutal power struggle. The conflict between Gallo's faction and Colombo's supporters led to a split within the family. Gallo, who had grown increasingly erratic in his actions, faced opposition not only from Colombo's supporters, but also from those loyal to the other powerful families in New York. Gallo's audacity and willingness to challenge the family leadership drew attention, and it also made him enemies within his own organization. Despite his growing notoriety, Gallo's life was characterized by his chaotic nature and inability to control his emotions. He made enemies quickly, and his volatile temper didn't help matters. His decision to openly defy the family and his aggressive attempts to take over leadership would ultimately prove to be his undoing. Gallo's defiance and reckless ambition eventually led to his death in 1972. In one of the most infamous mob killings in history, Joe Gallo was gunned down at a restaurant in Manhattan. On the night of April 7th, Gallo and his associates were dining at Umberto's Clam House in Little Italy when a gunman opened fire on him. The assassination was swift and brutal, with Gallo shot multiple times in a public brazen hit. It was a mob-style execution, carried out in the open with no regard for the potential fallout. The murder of Joe Gallo shocked the underworld, and many within the mafia saw it as a warning to others who might consider defying the established order. The hit was widely believed to have been ordered by Carmine the Beast Persico, the leader of the Colombo family, who saw Gallo's challenge to his authority as a threat to his power. Gallo's murder was a direct result of his rebellion against the family leadership and his role in the attempted assassination of Joseph Colombo. The aftermath of Gallo's death left the Colombo family in turmoil. His murder was never fully resolved, and while many believed that Persico orchestrated the hit, no one was ever charged. Gallo's death also served as a cautionary tale within the mafia, demonstrating the dangers of ambition and the consequences of trying to upend the status quo within the criminal world. While Joe Gallo had risen to prominence with his defiance, he ultimately paid the ultimate price for his challenge to the mob's leadership. Gallo's story remains one of the most compelling in the history of the American mafia. His rise from a small-time criminal to one of the most notorious figures in New York's criminal underworld is a testament to his ambition and ruthlessness. However, his inability to temper his violent nature and his refusal to accept the authority of his superiors ultimately led to his demise. In the mafia, where loyalty and silence are valued above all else, Gallo's brazen disregard for these codes of conduct proved to be his undoing. His death, though inevitable given his actions, marked the end of a turbulent chapter in the story of organized crime in America. Vito Genovese's name resonates as one of the most notorious and ambitious figures in the history of the Genovese crime family, one of New York's most powerful mafia families. His life was marked by ruthlessness, power struggles, betrayal, and a deep desire to control all aspects of the criminal empire. Genovese's story is a testament to the dangers of unchecked ambition and the constant battles for supremacy within the mafia underworld. His eventual downfall, marked by time spent in prison and ultimately his death, would signal the end of his reign and a shift in the criminal landscape of New York. Born in Naples, Italy in 1897, Vito Genovese immigrated to the United States as a young man, eventually settling in New York City. Genovese was drawn into the world of organized crime early on, working under notorious figures like Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, who were at the helm of the rival five families. These early years under the wings of the established mafia bosses laid the foundation for Genovese's rise, but they also exposed him to the cutthroat nature of the mafia's power struggles. Genovese's most notable rise came after the violent war between Masseria and Maranzano, which would define much of the mafia's future structure. After Masseria's death in 1931, Charles Lucky Luciano emerged as the dominant figure in the mafia, consolidating power and bringing a degree of organization to the once fragmented families. Genovese aligned himself with Luciano, who became a lifelong mentor and ally. Under Luciano's leadership, Genovese was able to grow in influence within the Genovese family, which was initially led by Francesco Ciccio Romano. In the 1930s, however, Genovese's ambitions began to grow, and he saw an opportunity to seize power within the family. He orchestrated the murder of Francesco Romano in 1937, claiming the leadership of the family for himself. But Genovese was a master manipulator, and knew that consolidating power meant navigating a web of deceit, alliances, and betrayal. He turned on those who had once supported him and eliminated rivals when necessary. Over time, his influence spread throughout New York, and by the 1940s, the Genovese family was among the strongest in the mafia world. However, Genovese's thirst for power was his greatest flaw. During World War II, he was arrested and convicted on charges of racketeering and drug trafficking, a blow to his growing empire. But in true mafia fashion, Genovese's influence didn't wane for long. After serving time in prison, Genovese returned to New York and resumed his rise to power. He was instrumental in organizing the National Crime Syndicate, a powerful coalition of criminal organizations across the United States, and worked with other mafia families to control illegal operations, including gambling, drug trafficking, and labor racketeering. Despite his success, Genovese's reign was plagued by the constant threat of imprisonment and betrayal. His most significant rivalry was with Frank Costello, the boss of the Lucchese family, who was a more public figure with a more moderate approach to running the mafia. Costello's style of diplomacy and his relatively soft approach to managing his operations stood in stark contrast to Genovese's brutal, authoritarian methods. In 1957, Genovese orchestrated an attempt to eliminate Costello, having him shot in a botched assassination attempt. Costello survived but withdrew from active leadership, leaving Genovese in full control of the Lucchese family. The killing was a turning point, as it cemented Genovese's position at the top of the mafia hierarchy. However, his success was short-lived. In 1958, just after taking over the family, Genovese was arrested once again for his involvement in a multi-million-dollar narcotics trafficking operation. His conviction led to a lengthy prison sentence, and he was sent to the Atlanta Penitentiary, where he continued to control the family from behind bars. His influence, however, began to wane, as rival factions within the mafia began to challenge his authority. In prison, Genovese's health deteriorated rapidly, and his influence became less absolute. By the early 1960s, Genovese's time in prison and his declining health left him vulnerable. His grip on the family loosened, and under his absence, the power structure within the Genovese family began to shift, with new leaders rising to take control. Genovese's inability to maintain his empire from behind bars and his failure to adapt to the changing nature of mafia operations weakened his once mighty family. Genovese died in 1969 while serving his sentence, marking the end of an era for the Genovese crime family. His death was the final chapter in the story of one of the most ambitious and dangerous mob bosses in history. His reign had been built on ruthless violence, betrayal, and an unyielding desire for control. But in the end, it was his inability to adapt to the changing underworld and his declining health that led to his downfall. The story of Vito Genovese serves as a reminder of the dangerous game of power in the mafia. His rise to power was marked by bloodshed and strategic alliances, and his fall was as dramatic as his rise. His legacy, while marked by his contributions to the criminal underworld, is a story of how ambition and betrayal can create empires that are as fragile as they are powerful. Carlo Gambino, the boss of the Gambino crime family, is often regarded as one of the most influential figures in the history of the American mafia. Known for his calm demeanor, strategic mind, and ability to manipulate the mafia's political landscape, Gambino became the undisputed leader of one of the 5 families of New York. However, his rise to power was not only defined by his quiet strength, but by the violence, betrayal, and cunning that inevitably accompany life in the mafia. Born in Palermo, Sicily in 1902, Carlo Gambino immigrated to the United States in the early 1920s. Like many Italian immigrants at the time, he was drawn to the world of organized crime, which provided him with an opportunity for wealth and status. Upon arriving in New York, Gambino quickly became involved with the Genovese family, which was one of the most powerful families in the mafia at the time. His early work involved extortion, theft, and running illegal rackets. However, Gambino's talents were not limited to petty crime. He quickly demonstrated a keen, strategic mind and a knack for making alliances that would serve him well in the future. In the 1930s, Gambino made his move into the inner circle of the Salvatore "Lucky" Luciano family. Luciano, widely regarded as the godfather who reorganized the mafia in the 1930s, brought order to the chaotic world of organized crime. He introduced the concept of the Commission, a governing body that oversaw the 5 families and helped mediate disputes. Gambino's connection to Luciano would prove pivotal in his rise to power, as it placed him in a strategic position to influence the direction of the mafia. When Luciano was imprisoned in the early 1940s, Gambino worked his way into the upper ranks of the mafia under the leadership of Vito Genovese. However, Gambino's ambition was never fully satisfied by simply being a soldier in someone else's family. In the early 1950s, when Albert Anastasia, the boss of the Anastasia crime family, was murdered, Gambino seized the opportunity to take control. Anastasia's death, which remains one of the most controversial in mafia history, was believed to have been orchestrated by Gambino, as well as his allies within the mafia. Gambino's transition from underboss to boss was marked by calm, strategic planning rather than explosive violence. Unlike other mob bosses, Gambino was not known for his temper or flamboyance. He did not seek the spotlight, instead operating with a quiet efficiency that earned him the respect of his associates and rivals alike. As boss of the Gambino family, he oversaw the family's expansion into drug trafficking, extortion, and illegal gambling, making the Gambino family one of the most powerful and profitable in the mafia world. During his reign, Gambino was known for his ability to avoid law enforcement attention. Unlike many other mafia bosses who attracted the FBI's scrutiny, Gambino kept his dealings low profile and rarely appeared in public. He was meticulous in maintaining the family's business operations and knew how to keep a tight grip on his criminal empire while avoiding prosecution. His leadership marked a period of stability for the Gambino family, but his influence extended far beyond the world of organized crime. Gambino was known to have ties with politicians and business leaders, using his influence to manipulate labor unions, rig contracts, and launder money. However, as with most mafia leaders, Gambino's life was marked by both triumph and tragedy. In the 1970s, the law began to catch up with him, and Gambino's health started to deteriorate. He was facing numerous charges for his involvement in various criminal enterprises, including racketeering, money laundering, and drug trafficking. Despite his efforts to evade conviction, Gambino knew that his time at the top was limited. His longtime associate and eventual successor, Paul Castellano, was eventually convicted and sentenced to prison, and Gambino's health issues worsened. In 1976, Carlo Gambino's reign came to a quiet end. At the age of 74, he died of natural causes at his home in Long Island, New York. His death marked the end of an era for the Gambino family. Although John Gotti would go on to succeed him as boss, Gambino's legacy as the quiet mastermind behind the family's vast criminal empire remained intact. Under his leadership, the Gambino family had solidified its control over the most lucrative aspects of organized crime, and his influence continued to be felt in the years that followed. What made Gambino's death particularly significant was the way it highlighted the legacy of his leadership. While his underboss, Paul Castellano, had expected to take over the family, it was John Gotti, another ambitious figure, who would ultimately seize control of the Gambino family through his ruthless assassination of Castellano in 1985. Gotti, who later became known as the Teflon Don, was in many ways a reflection of Gambino's leadership style, ruthless, but far more open and attention-seeking. In contrast, Gambino's ability to quietly amass power, secure his family's place at the top, and evade law enforcement scrutiny set him apart as one of the most successful mob bosses of his time. Gambino's legacy is complex. On one hand, he built a criminal empire that brought immense wealth and power to his family. On the other, his story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of mafia life, the constant betrayals, the endless pursuit of power, and the inevitable downfall that awaits all those who rise to the top. Gambino's leadership style, which balanced secrecy with ruthless efficiency, allowed him to avoid the public violence and scandals that plagued other mob bosses. Yet his reign also laid the groundwork for the violent events that would follow in the Gambino family, particularly with Gotti's rise to power. In the end, Carlo Gambino's story is a reminder of the dark allure of power and the costs that come with a life in the criminal underworld. His rise, reign, and quiet death are the stuff of legend, and his influence on the mafia world continues to be felt to this day. His ability to remain under the radar while building one of the most powerful crime families in America is a testament to his skill and cunning. However, as the Gambino family ultimately fell apart in the years following his death, Gambino's quiet departure from the scene also underscored the transient nature of power in the mafia. Frank Costello, known as the Prime Minister of the Mafia, was one of the most influential and enigmatic figures in American organized crime during the mid-20th century. His rise to power within the Genovese crime family and his ability to avoid public attention made him a fascinating character in the history of the mafia. Unlike many of his counterparts, Costello preferred subtlety over violence, often using his intellect and connections to climb the ranks. His reign, though marked by his immense power, was also defined by the betrayal that ultimately led to his downfall. Costello was born Francesco Castiglia in 1891 in Italy, immigrating with his family to the United States in the early 1900s. Settling in New York, Costello's early years were marked by poverty, but he quickly became involved in the criminal underworld. Costello initially worked with small-time crooks and thieves, but he gradually made connections with Joe Masseria, one of the most powerful mafia bosses of the time. Masseria, who ran much of the criminal activity in New York, became an early mentor to Costello, teaching him the intricacies of running a mafia family. When Masseria was murdered in 1931, it marked the beginning of the power struggle that would define Costello's career. After Masseria's death, Lucky Luciano emerged as the dominant figure in the Genovese family, and Costello became his trusted ally. Luciano, along with other mafia bosses, sought to reorganize the mafia's operations, creating the National Crime Syndicate and establishing the Commission, which would oversee the activities of all 5 families in New York. Costello's intelligence and diplomatic approach made him an invaluable figure in Luciano's rise to power. However, Costello's influence was not rooted in violence. Unlike the more notorious mafia bosses, Costello preferred to operate quietly, using his business acumen and political connections to further the family's interests. He had a reputation for being the Prime Minister of the Mafia, a behind-the-scenes figure who used charm, negotiation, and strategy to get what he wanted. Costello had a particular talent for manipulating politicians, police officers, and businessmen to secure the family's hold on various illegal enterprises. He was particularly influential in labor racketeering, where his control over unions allowed the Genovese family to dominate lucrative industries such as construction and garbage collection. In the 1940s, Costello's influence was at its peak. He controlled the political landscape in New York, and his connections extended far beyond the criminal underworld. Costello was deeply involved in New York's political machine, maintaining ties with local politicians, including influential figures in both the Democratic Party and Republican Party. He was instrumental in helping elect politicians who would advance the interests of the mafia, securing lucrative deals and favorable treatment for his family's operations. His power extended to the highest echelons of government and law enforcement, making him virtually untouchable. Costello's greatest strength was his ability to avoid the spotlight. While other mobsters craved the limelight and enjoyed flaunting their power, Costello remained largely out of the public eye. His persona was that of a refined businessman, not a street thug. He dressed impeccably, spoke intelligently, and was known for his politeness and charm. His refined demeanor earned him respect not only in criminal circles, but also in the world of legitimate business. Many saw him as a man of culture, and he was even a frequent guest at high society events. However, this quiet dominance would soon come to an end. In 1957, Costello's reign was challenged by a violent faction within the Luciano family, led by Vito Genovese, a member of the family who had long been dissatisfied with Costello's leadership. Genovese, who had a more aggressive approach to the mafia, sought to take control of the family by ousting Costello. Genovese had been plotting against Costello for years, and in 1957 he orchestrated an assassination attempt on Costello. While Costello survived the hit, he was badly injured and lost much of his influence within the family. The attempt on Costello's life marked a turning point. Although Costello was still alive, his power had been severely diminished. After the attack, he decided to step down as the boss of the Genovese family, ceding control to Genovese. Despite this, Costello maintained a degree of respect in the criminal world and continued to have influence, but he was no longer the dominant figure he had once been. Costello's retirement was relatively quiet, and he spent his remaining years living in relative obscurity. However, his fall from power was not without consequences. Costello's reputation as a skilled negotiator and political manipulator had been built over decades, but his failure to maintain control of the family left him vulnerable. Despite his withdrawal from the mafia, he was still involved in the underworld, but his diminished power meant that he was less protected than before. In 1973, Costello was gunned down outside his apartment in New York, marking the end of his life. His death was attributed to a rival faction within the mafia, and while some believed it was an act of vengeance for his earlier fall from power, others speculated that it was the result of his shifting allegiances and his failure to maintain the influence he once commanded. Regardless of the motive, Costello's death signaled the end of an era for the Genovese family and the American mafia as a whole. Costello's legacy is one of quiet power and calculated strategy. His ability to manipulate politicians and business leaders made him one of the most successful mafia bosses in history, and his leadership style was one of diplomacy and intelligence rather than brute force. However, his downfall serves as a reminder of the fragility of power in the world of organized crime. Even those who avoid the limelight and work behind the scenes are not immune to the violence and betrayal that define the mafia. Richard Kuklinski, known as the Iceman, was one of the most feared and notorious hitmen in the history of organized crime. His chilling nickname, the Iceman, came from his method of freezing the bodies of his victims to delay the time of death. making it difficult for authorities to determine the exact cause of death. Kuklinski's cold-blooded approach to murder and his involvement in a series of high-profile mafia-related killings make him one of the most terrifying figures in the criminal world. His story is one of deception, violence, and a shocking level of detachment from human life. Born in 1935 in Jersey City, New Jersey, Kuklinski grew up in a violent household where he suffered physical abuse from his father. This early exposure to violence likely shaped Kuklinski's psyche, and by his teenage years, he was already involved in petty crimes. However, it wasn't long before his skills in violence were recognized by the mob. Kuklinski was recruited by the DeCavalcante crime family, a mafia organization that was connected to the powerful Genovese crime family in New York. What set Kuklinski apart from other mafia hitmen was his ability to carry out cold and calculated murders without any emotional attachment. Unlike many criminals who were driven by anger or revenge, Kuklinski was a professional killer, hired to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to his employers. His cold demeanor and ability to compartmentalize his actions made him an ideal candidate for the type of high-stakes killings that the mafia needed. Kuklinski's reputation as a hitman grew rapidly. He was involved in numerous murders, and his methods were as varied as they were brutal. He would kill with poison, firearms, strangulation, or even blunt force trauma. One of his most infamous methods was freezing the bodies of his victims, a technique he used to confuse investigators and delay the discovery of the crime. He would often transport the body to a remote location where he would leave it to thaw out, making it look as if the victim had died much later than they actually had. This cold, methodical approach to killing earned him the nickname the Iceman. In addition to his work as a hitman, Kuklinski was involved in a number of criminal activities, including drug trafficking, robbery, and extortion. He was known to have worked with various mafia families as well as independent crime figures. Despite his involvement in the mafia, Kuklinski's brutal methods often made him an unpredictable and uncontrollable figure in the underworld. He had a reputation for not being loyal to any particular group, which led to strained relationships with some of his mob associates. In the early 1970s, Kuklinski began working for a powerful mafia boss named Roy DeMeo. DeMeo was known for his violent nature and his willingness to do whatever was necessary to maintain his power. He tasked Kuklinski with carrying out contract killings, including some of the most notorious murders in mafia history. The most infamous of these was his involvement in the DeMeo crew's murder spree, where several victims were disposed of in horrific ways. DeMeo's crew was responsible for over 100 murders, many of which were carried out by Kuklinski. His connection to DeMeo marked the peak of his career as a hitman. Despite his success as a killer, Kuklinski's life began to unravel in the 1980s. His activities started to attract more attention from law enforcement, and his violent behavior led to increasing tension with his mafia associates. Kuklinski, who had always prided himself on being a professional, began to show signs of instability, which made his superiors nervous. His erratic behavior and his habit of leaving witnesses behind made him a liability to the criminal organizations that had once relied on him. In 1986, Kuklinski's downfall began when he was arrested for a drug-related murder that he had committed. The arrest led to a series of interviews and confessions, during which Kuklinski revealed the extent of his crimes. He admitted to killing over 200 people, though law enforcement officials believe the true number of victims may have been higher. His confession, combined with his chilling demeanor and lack of remorse, stunned the public and the criminal world alike. Kuklinski's trial in 1988 was a media sensation as he became a symbol of the psychopathic hitman. During the trial, his actions were analyzed and his cold, emotionless nature was examined in detail. His behavior suggested a man who was completely detached from the value of human life. While his trial was ongoing, Kuklinski continued to express no remorse for his actions, and he even seemed proud of his reputation. His defense team tried to argue that he was a victim of his upbringing and the mafia's influence, but it did little to sway the jury. In the end, Kuklinski was convicted of several murders and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was incarcerated in Trenton State Prison in New Jersey, where he spent the rest of his days. Despite his time in prison, Kuklinski maintained that he was a professional hitman and that the murders he committed were just part of the job. His lack of remorse and his cold, calculating nature made him one of the most terrifying figures in the history of organized crime. Kuklinski died in 2006 at the age of 70, reportedly from heart failure. Despite his death, his story remains one of the most disturbing and chilling in the world of organized crime. The Iceman's ability to kill with such precision and coldness has left an indelible mark on the criminal world. His story serves as a reminder of the dark side of human nature, where violence and ruthlessness can become a way of life for those involved in organized crime. Joe Bonanno's name is synonymous with the rise and fall of one of the most powerful and influential mafia families in the United States, the Bonanno crime family. His life story is a testament to the complex web of ambition, betrayal, and power struggles that defined the early years of the American mafia. Known for his cunning, ambition, and strategic alliances, Bonanno's rise to power within the five families of New York was marked by a series of ruthless moves and calculated decisions. However, his later years would be defined by his infamous fall from grace, as he defied the established order of the mafia and caused a rift that would lead to his eventual exile and a lasting legacy of controversy. Born in Palermo, Sicily, in 1905, Bonanno immigrated to the United States as a young man. Like many others from Sicily, he was drawn to the criminal underworld, which offered opportunities for wealth and status in the tough neighborhoods of New York City. Bonanno quickly established himself in the Sicilian mafia, working his way up through the ranks of the Castellamarese clan, which was one of the most powerful factions in New York's mafia scene during the early 20th century. By the 1930s, Bonanno had become a trusted member of the Castellamarese family, which was led by Salvatore Maranzano. Maranzano's leadership was central to the formation of the Commission, the governing body of the five families that would come to control much of organized crime in the United States. However, this era was not without its internal strife. Lucky Luciano, the rising star of the mafia, had other plans, and he sought to challenge Maranzano's authority. The famous Castellamarese War between Maranzano's faction and Luciano's forces escalated into a violent confrontation that would alter the structure of the mafia in New York forever. Bonanno, whose loyalty to Maranzano was unquestioned, found himself on the losing side of the war. After Maranzano was assassinated in 1931, Luciano emerged victorious and restructured the mafia, placing himself at the top of the new hierarchy. Though Bonanno had lost his patron in Maranzano, his intelligence and ability to build alliances allowed him to survive and thrive under Luciano's new order. In the years that followed, Bonanno's influence grew within the five families, and in 1931 he was appointed as the boss of the Bonanno family, named after him after the previous boss was taken out of power. Under Bonanno's leadership, the family grew rapidly, taking control of vast criminal operations, including smuggling, drug trafficking, extortion, and loan sharking. Bonanno maintained a low profile compared to other more flamboyant mafia bosses like Gambino or Luciano, preferring to operate in the shadows and avoid attention. This discretion helped him build an empire without the risks associated with drawing too much law enforcement scrutiny. Bonanno's ambitions, however, were not limited to the control of the Bonanno family. In the 1950s, he began to see himself as a potential ruler of the entire mafia, not just one family. His dreams of becoming the supreme boss of the commission itself put him at odds with other mafia leaders, including Vito Genovese, who saw Bonanno's rise as a threat to his own ambitions. Bonanno began to push for more power, which ultimately led to tensions within the mafia. It was these tensions that would lead to a violent rift, which would later define Bonanno's fall from power. In 1964, Bonanno's world began to unravel. His ambition to take control of the entire mafia structure led him to attempt a power grab that ultimately resulted in a betrayal. Bonanno's plot to dominate the commission and remove rivals like Luciano and Genovese was discovered, and Bonanno was kidnapped by his own men who were loyal to Genovese. He was held captive for several years, during which he was forced to give up his position as the boss of the Bonanno family. Bonanno's kidnapping marked the beginning of his downfall, as his criminal empire, once so carefully built, began to disintegrate. After his release, Bonanno was stripped of his power and sent into exile. He spent several years living under various aliases, traveling across the United States and Canada, trying to avoid law enforcement while keeping his low profile. The family was in chaos, with internal power struggles and the loss of Bonanno's leadership, and Bonanno's once great influence over New York's mafia had been severely diminished. Bonanno's attempt to regain power would prove unsuccessful. Despite his attempts to reassert control over the Bonanno family, he was never able to recover the prominence and authority he once held. In 1966, Bonanno was finally convicted of racketeering, and his public association with organized crime led to his eventual conviction and sentencing. He was forced to give up any remaining influence in the mafia. In the end, Bonanno spent his remaining years living in relative obscurity. He was granted a conditional release in 1974 and spent his later years under a witness protection program. He died in 2002 at the age of 97, having lived a life filled with violence, betrayal, and disillusionment. Bonanno's story is a testament to the shifting power dynamics within the world of organized crime. His rise to power, his dream of controlling the mafia, and his eventual fall into obscurity demonstrate the dangers of ambition and the unpredictable nature of the mafia world. While he was once at the top of the criminal world, his actions ultimately led to his isolation and demise. His legacy is one of a man who defied the traditional mafia code, attempted to reshape the structure of organized crime, and ultimately paid the price for his hubris. Bonanno's story serves as a stark reminder that in the criminal underworld, no one is invincible, not even the most ambitious and calculating leaders. The pursuit of power, while lucrative, is always fraught with danger, and in the end, the mafia's ruthless code of loyalty and betrayal ensures that no one remains at the top forever. Raymond Patriarca, the enigmatic and ruthless boss of the Patriarca crime family, controlled New England for decades, shaping the region's mafia scene with his iron-fisted leadership and cold strategic mind. Operating largely under the radar, Patriarca's criminal empire, though often overshadowed by the more well-known families of New York, was a potent force in the mafia world. His reign marked a pivotal period for the mafia's influence over not just organized crime, but the political and economic machinery of an entire region. His life was a testament to the delicate balance of power, loyalty, and betrayal that underpins the world of organized crime. Born in 1908 in Providence, Rhode Island, Patriarca grew up in a time when organized crime was firmly rooted in the fabric of New England's social and economic structure. From a young age, he was involved in the criminal activities that ran rampant in his neighborhood, including petty theft, bootlegging, and later, more sophisticated schemes like loan sharking and racketeering. Patriarca was a natural at working the system, and his quick rise through the criminal underworld was marked by his ability to form alliances with key figures in the region's political and economic circles. By the 1940s, Patriarca had established himself as a powerful figure in the New England Mafia, which was at the time a relatively small but influential organization. The Patriarca family was based in Providence, but Patriarca's reach extended through Boston, Hartford, and other parts of the northeastern U.S. He was known for his ability to control territory without resorting to the loud public violence of some of his New York counterparts. Instead, Patriarca's method was quiet influence and strategic manipulation, ensuring that key players in government, labor unions, and businesses were on his payroll or under his sway. Unlike many mafia bosses, Patriarca preferred to keep a low profile. He rarely made public appearances and was known for operating his criminal empire from the shadows. His family was involved in a variety of criminal enterprises, including extortion, drug trafficking, illegal gambling, and prostitution. However, his most profitable ventures involved his control over the dock workers' unions and his ability to extort large sums of money from legitimate businesses. His influence in local politics and labor unions allowed him to keep his criminal activities hidden, often from law enforcement and the public eye. However, despite his quiet manner, Patriarca's leadership was marked by a certain ruthlessness. He used violence when necessary, but he was more strategic in his approach, preferring to neutralize threats through bribery, coercion, and blackmail. One of his most significant moves was his involvement in the creation of the New England Mafia's criminal network, which united several smaller factions under his control. This network allowed him to expand his influence, gain control over more territory, and increase his wealth. Patriarca's connections to other mafia families, including the Genovese and Gambino families, helped to solidify his place in the larger mafia structure. While Patriarca was a calculated and shrewd operator, his rise was not without competition. His leadership was challenged by rival mobsters, especially in the volatile world of organized crime. In the 1950s, Patriarca's main rival was Raymond L.S. Patriarca of the Boston-based Angelo, the Hook, Gallo family, who was deeply involved in the area's criminal rackets. Patriarca was accused of multiple murders and intimidation of the local authorities. However, Patriarca managed to secure the top position with a combination of skillful intimidation tactics and deft political connections. In the 1960s, the FBI launched extensive investigations into the mafia, focusing on Patriarca's operation. During this time, Patriarca was arrested for charges related to racketeering, money laundering, drug trafficking, and even murder. Despite the legal troubles, Patriarca's ability to control the operations continued to protect him and his associates. He used his political influence to avoid prosecution for many years, demonstrating his unique capacity to blend criminal operations with legitimate businesses. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Patriarca continued to dominate New England's mafia operations, but as he aged, his grip on power began to weaken. His direct involvement in family operations diminished, and his son, Salvatore Patriarca, gradually assumed more responsibility within the family. However, in 1984, Patriarca was arrested on charges of murder and conspiracy. The case was brought by the FBI, who had been tracking the Patriarca family's illegal operations for years. In the aftermath of the 1984 arrests, the Patriarca family's operations were severely impacted, and Raymond Patriarca's leadership was officially ended. He spent his final years fighting off attempts at control from rival factions within his family, ultimately dying in 1985 at the age of 77. His death signaled the end of an era for New England's mafia, and the family's power diminished in the years that followed. Patriarca's legacy is a complex one. While his criminal operations were marked by violence and deception, his leadership also displayed a level of sophistication and strategic thinking that set him apart from many other mafia bosses. His ability to maintain power for as long as he did, without the public violence that often marked his rivals, shows just how deeply ingrained organized crime was in the fabric of New England society. His story also underscores the danger of overreaching ambition, as his family's eventual downfall was partly a result of internal power struggles and shifting alliances in the world of organized crime. Despite the fall of the Patriarca family, Raymond Patriarca's influence on New England's mafia is still felt today. His role in shaping the region's criminal landscape, his ability to manipulate political systems, and his methods of managing organized crime paved the way for future generations of mobsters. While the Patriarca crime family may have been broken by the time of his death, his legacy remains a testament to the power and tenacity of one of the most dangerous and calculating figures in the mafia's history. James Riddle Hoffa, often referred to simply as Jimmy Hoffa, was a towering figure in American labor history. His rise to power as the leader of the Teamsters Union, one of the most influential labor organizations in the country, intertwined him deeply with organized crime. Hoffa's ability to manipulate both labor and mafia bosses helped shape his career, but his eventual disappearance in 1975 remains one of the most enduring mysteries in American history. Hoffa's involvement with the mafia and his eventual disappearance highlight the dangerous intersection between labor unions, organized crime, and political power. Born in 1913 in Indiana, Hoffa's early life was marked by poverty and hardship. As a young man, he became involved in labor activism, quickly recognizing the power of unions to secure better wages and working conditions for blue-collar workers. Hoffa's leadership skills and charisma earned him respect within the union movement, and by the 1950s he had become the national president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, IBT. Under Hoffa's leadership, the Teamsters grew to become one of the most powerful unions in the United States, with millions of members across the country. However, Hoffa's success came at a cost. Throughout his career, he formed close alliances with organized crime syndicates, particularly those involved in the mafia. The Teamsters were heavily involved in the construction industry, trucking, and other labor-intensive businesses that were prime targets for mafia influence. Hoffa, who was known for his ability to broker deals and secure power for his union, worked closely with mob bosses in cities across the U.S. to ensure the Teamsters' control over labor unions and their profits. Hoffa's relationship with the mafia was not just a business arrangement, it was a symbiotic partnership. The mob provided Hoffa with the muscle and the influence to crush rivals and maintain control over the union, while Hoffa provided the mafia with access to labor resources and a network of corrupt officials. In exchange for their support, Hoffa was able to secure large sums of money for the Teamsters, which were often funneled into organized crime operations. Hoffa's connections with crime families like the Genovese, Gambino, and Lucchese families were well known, and his union was used as a conduit for mafia-related rackets, including extortion, money laundering, and loan sharking. As Hoffa's influence grew, so did his involvement with some of the most notorious criminals of his time. His close ties to figures like Anthony "Tony" Jack Giacalone, a leading member of the Detroit Mafia, and Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, a member of the Gambino family, made Hoffa an increasingly controversial figure. His relationship with these mobsters was mutually beneficial, but it also put him in direct conflict with both law enforcement and rival unions. Hoffa's rise and eventual fall were marked by a series of legal battles, including charges of bribery, fraud, and jury tampering. His convictions for various criminal activities led to his imprisonment in the 1960s. However, Hoffa's time in prison did little to tarnish his reputation. Even behind bars, he remained a powerful figure in the labor movement, maintaining control over the Teamsters through intermediaries. After serving 4 years in prison, Hoffa was released in 1971 following a pardon from President Richard Nixon. Hoffa was determined to return to power, but his efforts to regain control of the Teamsters were met with resistance from both union leaders and the Mafia. By the mid-1970s, Hoffa's political power was waning. He sought to reclaim his position as the head of the Teamsters, but this put him in direct conflict with his former allies in the Mafia, who feared that Hoffa's return would upset the balance of power that had developed in his absence. Hoffa's ambitions were not limited to union leadership. He also sought to regain control over the Mafia's influence within the Teamsters and bring his organization back into alignment with the national crime syndicate. This was a direct challenge to the Mafia families that had benefited from Hoffa's absence. On the afternoon of July 30th, 1975, Hoffa vanished without a trace. He had made plans to meet with Giacalone and James Riddle Hoffa's sons, hoping to broker a deal that would secure his return to power. He was last seen outside the Match's Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, Michigan, but no one ever saw him again. Hoffa's sudden disappearance has sparked decades of speculation, theories, and investigations, but the truth remains unknown to this day. Some believe Hoffa was murdered by the Mafia to prevent him from regaining control of the Teamsters, while others speculate that he may have been killed by his own associates due to the threat he posed to their criminal operations. Theories about Hoffa's death abound. Some say he was buried in a secret location near Detroit, while others claim he was dumped in the New Jersey swamps or even cremated. Law enforcement has pursued countless leads over the years, but Hoffa's disappearance remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American crime history. Many of those who were involved in his life, both within the Mafia and the Teamsters, have either denied knowledge of his fate or died before they could offer any concrete answers. Despite his mysterious disappearance, Hoffa's legacy in American organized crime cannot be ignored. His control over the Teamsters made him one of the most powerful figures in the nation, and his association with the Mafia helped shape the criminal landscape of post-war America. Hoffa's name became synonymous with union corruption, organized crime, and political manipulation. His story is a cautionary tale of ambition, loyalty, and betrayal, reminding us of the risks involved in challenging the power structures of organized crime and the dangerous intersection between labor unions and the Mafia. To this day, Hoffa's disappearance is a subject of speculation, with documentaries, books, and films attempting to unravel the mystery. While the FBI continues to investigate, the truth behind Hoffa's final hours remains one of the most elusive and disturbing aspects of Mafia history. Charles "Lucky" Luciano is often referred to as the man who fundamentally transformed the American Mafia from a loose confederation of criminal families into a more organized, business-like structure. His strategic vision for the mafia and his ruthless tactics revolutionized organized crime in the early 20th century, establishing Luciano as one of the most significant figures in mafia history. However, his rise to power was not without bloodshed, betrayal, and a series of violent confrontations with both rival mobsters and law enforcement. His eventual fall from power serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of ambition and the cost of betrayal in the criminal underworld. Born in 1897 in Sicily, Luciano immigrated to the United States with his family as a child, settling in New York City. Like many of his contemporaries, Luciano was drawn into the world of organized crime from an early age. He quickly became involved with local gangsters and made his mark as a street hustler, engaging in petty crimes such as theft, extortion, and smuggling. By the 1920s, Luciano had already started working under influential mafia figures like Arnold Rothstein and Johnny Torrio, two of the most powerful men in the mafia world at the time. Luciano's ability to manipulate people, coupled with his keen understanding of how the criminal world operated, allowed him to rise quickly through the ranks. He became involved in the bootlegging trade during Prohibition, when alcohol was illegal but in high demand. Luciano was instrumental in organizing the smuggling of alcohol across New York and other cities, making enormous profits for himself and his allies. As Prohibition created new opportunities for organized crime, Luciano saw a chance to expand the mafia's reach far beyond its traditional operations in the gambling and extortion rackets. By the early 1930s, Luciano's rise to power reached a pivotal moment. He recognized that the fragmented nature of the mafia was inefficient and often led to violence and rivalry between families. In 1931, Luciano orchestrated a coup against the existing boss of bosses, Salvatore Maranzano, who had been ruling the Sicilian mafia. Maranzano had been a figurehead of the old-school mafia, focusing on traditional values of loyalty and secrecy. Luciano, on the other hand, believed that the future of organized crime lay in modernization and consolidation. Luciano's plot culminated in the murder of Maranzano, which left Luciano in control of not only the Genovese family, but also the entire mafia structure in America. His move was brilliant and ruthless. He essentially eliminated the old guard and restructured the mafia into a more formalized system, introducing the idea of the Commission, a governing body that represented the interests of all the major crime families. The Commission would serve as a neutral body to resolve disputes between families and keep the mafia's operations running smoothly. This move helped Luciano solidify his control and marked the beginning of the golden age of the mafia in America. Luciano's control over the mafia was not absolute, and his rise to power was characterized by significant violence and betrayal. His actions angered certain factions within the underworld, and as his empire expanded, so did his enemies. However, Luciano's ability to create alliances and broker deals with other criminal organizations, including the Jewish mob and the Irish-American gangs, helped to maintain his position. His business-minded approach to crime helped him create a more organized, profitable enterprise that dominated the criminal landscape. In 1936, Luciano's reign was interrupted by a federal crackdown on organized crime. The U.S. government, led by Thomas Dewey, had long been investigating Luciano for his role in the bootlegging trade and his connections to labor unions and politicians. In 1936, after a lengthy investigation, Luciano was convicted on charges of compulsory prostitution and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. Luciano's conviction was a blow to his carefully built empire, but his impact on the mafia would prove to be long-lasting. While serving his sentence at Sing Sing prison, Luciano remained a significant figure in the criminal world. He was able to maintain control over his operations from behind bars, often using his connections with political figures and law enforcement to secure favors. However, the loss of his freedom was a serious blow to his influence, and by the early 1940s, Luciano began looking for ways to regain his power. In 1942, during World War II, Luciano made a deal with the US government. In exchange for his cooperation in helping to secure the New York waterfront and ensure the safety of the docks from sabotage by foreign agents, Luciano was granted a conditional release from prison. He was deported to Italy, where his influence continued, albeit in a reduced capacity. Despite his exile, Luciano's ties to the mafia remained strong, and he continued to serve as a figurehead for the American mafia. In Italy, Luciano lived a relatively quiet life, enjoying the benefits of his earlier success. He had connections in Italy, as well as in Cuba, where he had previously made deals with mafia families involved in the casino and drug trade. However, Luciano's time in Italy was not without complications. In 1962, he was reportedly involved in a violent altercation with rival mafia figures, and rumors began circulating that he was planning a return to power in the US. This stirred the attention of the Italian government, who feared his influence would lead to further instability. Luciano died in 1962 under mysterious circumstances. Some speculate that his death was the result of a natural cause, while others suggest that the mafia, fearing a return to his previous power, had ordered his assassination. The truth behind his death remains unclear, but what is certain is that Luciano's legacy remains one of the most impactful in mafia history. His ability to reshape the mafia from a loose collection of criminal families into a more organized and profitable enterprise set the standard for how organized crime would operate for decades. Luciano's life story is one of triumph, betrayal, and ultimate tragedy. He was a man who saw opportunity in the chaos of prohibition and built an empire from the ground up, only to be brought down by the very system he sought to manipulate. His rise and fall mirror the cycle of ambition and power that defines the mafia: success followed by betrayal, and in the end, a slow and inevitable fall. Despite his downfall, Luciano's influence on the mafia world cannot be overstated. He was, and remains, a central figure in the history of organized crime. Carmine Persico, also known as the Beast, was a formidable figure in the world of organized crime. As the boss of the Colombo crime family, one of New York's notorious five families, Persico's life was defined by a ruthless rise to power, a series of bloody power struggles, and a long stint behind bars that left an indelible mark on the mafia. His story is a stark reminder of the dangers that accompany ambition in the underworld, where loyalty is often tested by betrayal and power comes at a heavy cost. Born in Brooklyn, New York in 1933, Carmine Persico was exposed to crime at a young age. The son of a well-known Italian-American criminal, he grew up in the rough neighborhoods of Brooklyn, where the mafia's influence was deeply rooted. Persico's entry into the criminal world was almost inevitable as he became involved in petty crimes, such as theft and extortion, from a young age. However, his ambition quickly outgrew the small-time hustle, and he began making connections with members of the Colombo family. The Colombo crime family, which had been one of the more prominent mafia families in New York, was at the center of power struggles during the 1960s. The family's previous boss, Joseph Colombo, had risen to power and sought to expand the family's interests in the city. But his leadership was marked by internal tensions and a growing rivalry with other mafia figures. Persico, a man of immense ambition, sought to position himself at the forefront of the family's operations. In the early 1970s, Persico's path to power became more apparent as he maneuvered his way into a leadership role within the family. He eventually orchestrated the assassination of his rival, Joe Gallo, in 1972. Gallo, once a key member of the family, had rebelled against Colombo's leadership and was a threat to Persico's ambition. The murder of Joe Gallo was a significant event that solidified Persico's control of the family. It was a move that not only removed a rival, but also sent a message to anyone else who would challenge his authority. By the mid-1970s, Carmine Persico had effectively taken control of the Colombo family. Under his leadership, the family became deeply involved in drug trafficking, racketeering, loan sharking, and extortion. Persico was known for his violent temper and his willingness to use brute force to maintain control. His leadership, however, was also marked by pragmatism, as he sought to modernize the family's operations and ensure its profitability. He was able to strike lucrative deals with other families and criminal organizations, including the Genovese and Gambino families, making the Colombo family one of the most powerful mafia entities in New York. However, Persico's rise was not without challenges. In 1975, Joseph Colombo, the family's former boss, was shot and paralyzed in a botched assassination attempt that many believed was orchestrated by Persico. This assassination attempt marked the beginning of a series of internal conflicts within the Colombo family. The Colombo family had become a target for rival factions and the FBI, which had been intensifying its efforts to crack down on organized crime. In 1978, Persico's reign was threatened when he was arrested for drug trafficking and other charges. Despite the mounting legal troubles, Persico managed to maintain control over the family. However, his legal problems only intensified, and by 1986 he was convicted on several charges, including racketeering and murder. He was sentenced to life in prison for his role in the family's criminal operations, effectively ending his reign as the boss of the Colombo family. Despite his imprisonment, Persico's influence did not immediately fade. From behind bars, he continued to control the Colombo family's operations, relying on his underbosses and associates to carry out his orders. He used inside connections, bribery, and intimidation to ensure that his family remained strong even while he was incarcerated. His hold on the family, however, began to weaken as the years went on, particularly with the rise of younger, more aggressive mobsters. In the years following his conviction, the Colombo family experienced significant internal conflict as different factions fought for control of the family's operations. Persico's absence from the streets left a power vacuum, and younger leaders within the family began to challenge his authority. Despite the turmoil, Persico remained a powerful figure within the world of organized crime, with many still viewing him as the true boss of the Colombo family. However, the family's influence began to wane, and by the early 2000s, the family was no longer the dominant force it had once been. Carmine Persico died in 2019 at the age of 85 in federal prison after spending nearly half of his life incarcerated. His death marked the end of an era for the Colombo crime family, which had been greatly weakened by his time in prison and the internal struggles that ensued after his fall from power. Persico's legacy, however, remains a testament to the ruthlessness and ambition that define the mafia. He was a man who built an empire through violence, betrayal, and strategic alliances, but in the end, it was those very traits that contributed to his eventual downfall. The story of Carmine the Beast Persico is a reminder of the high cost of ambition in the world of organized crime. His rise to power, his leadership, and his eventual fall highlight the dangers of operating in a world defined by loyalty, betrayal, and violence. While Persico's name may no longer hold the same weight it once did, his impact on the Colombo family and the Mafia's legacy is undeniable. Tony Accardo, known as Big Tuna in the criminal underworld, was one of the most influential and elusive figures in the history of American organized crime. As the boss of the Chicago outfit, Accardo's reign spanned several decades, from the 1940s to the 1970s, during which he maintained an iron grip over the city's criminal operations. His ability to remain out of the spotlight while simultaneously controlling vast swathes of Chicago's underworld made him a unique and powerful figure in the mafia. His story is one of calculated power, strategic alliances, and a deadly will to maintain control in an era where organized crime was both a shadow government and a thriving business empire. Born in Chicago in 1906, Tony Accardo was raised in a tough neighborhood where crime and violence were a way of life. Like many young men in his community, he was drawn into the world of organized crime at an early age. Accardo's first real taste of the mafia came when he joined the outfit as a young man, quickly rising through the ranks. His early criminal activities included petty theft, extortion, and working as a muscleman for the family, enforcing their will on rivals and making sure debts were paid. He quickly earned a reputation for his calm, calculating demeanor, earning the nickname Big Tuna because of his size and his ability to keep a low profile. Accardo's rise to power began in the 1930s, when he became involved with some of the biggest names in organized crime, including Al Capone. Capone, the infamous boss of the Chicago outfit, had built an empire on bootlegging during Prohibition, and Accardo quickly became one of his trusted lieutenants. When Capone was convicted and imprisoned for tax evasion in 1931, Accardo was well positioned to take over much of the operation. However, the shift in power was not immediate, and the Chicago outfit went through a series of turf wars as Capone's lieutenants scrambled to control the family. Accardo's real opportunity to seize power came in the wake of the St. Valentine's Day massacre in 1929, when 7 members of a rival gang were gunned down in a Chicago garage. Although the massacre was attributed to Capone's outfit, it was also a stark reminder of how cutthroat and violent the underworld had become. Accardo, always the strategist, understood the importance of maintaining control and minimizing violence within the family. After Capone's arrest, Accardo carefully navigated the power struggles within the outfit, ensuring his influence continued to grow without drawing the attention of law enforcement. By the 1940s, Accardo had become the boss of the Chicago outfit. Unlike his predecessors, Accardo preferred to operate behind the scenes, preferring to remain an elusive figure while maintaining tight control over the family's operations. His leadership was marked by extortion, loan sharking, and the protection racket. But one of his most lucrative ventures was gambling. Accardo controlled a vast network of casinos, bookmaking operations, and illegal gambling dens, making him one of the richest men in Chicago. One of Accardo's most significant contributions to the outfit's success was his ability to build alliances with other criminal organizations, both within the United States and abroad. He forged strong ties with the Genovese, Gambino and Lucchese families of New York, ensuring that the outfit remained a powerful player in the national criminal network. He also formed connections with labor unions and politicians, using his influence to protect his operations from law enforcement and ensure his family's wealth continued to grow. Despite his success, Accardo's life was not without challenges. He faced constant scrutiny from both the FBI and rival gangsters, and his leadership was always under threat. However, Accardo's ability to maintain control over his family was remarkable. He was not known for being violent or erratic like some of his mafia counterparts. Instead, he relied on calculation and subtlety. Accardo understood the importance of keeping a low profile and avoiding unnecessary conflict, which allowed him to remain at the top of the Chicago underworld for decades. Accardo's downfall, however, came in the 1970s as the mafia world began to change. The younger generation of gangsters, including figures like Tony Spilotro and John Gotti, were more willing to use violence and flaunt their power. These new mobsters did not have the same respect for the old rules that Accardo had followed, and as law enforcement began to crack down on organized crime, the once powerful Chicago outfit started to lose its grip on the city. Accardo's reluctance to adapt to the changing landscape of organized crime eventually led to his diminishing power. In 1972, Accardo stepped down from his role as the boss of the outfit, passing control to his protégé, Joseph Ayupa. Despite stepping away from the day-to-day operations of the family, Accardo remained a powerful figure in the criminal world, operating more like a godfather than a hands-on boss. His influence was still felt, but the family's power had already started to decline. The FBI continued to press its investigations into the outfit, and new federal laws and regulations made it harder for organized crime to operate with the same impunity as in the past. In 1978, Accardo's life came to an end when he died of natural causes. His death marked the end of an era for the Chicago outfit, which had been at the center of organized crime in America for decades. Accardo's legacy is a complex one. While he was known for his ability to maintain control and run the family with a level of sophistication not often seen in the mafia, he was also responsible for many of the brutal crimes that helped the outfit rise to power. His story serves as a reminder of the complexity of organized crime, where power is often built through manipulation, alliances, and a careful balance of violence and diplomacy. Accardo's ability to maintain his position for as long as he did is a testament to his skill as a strategist, but his eventual decline shows how quickly the tides can turn in the world of the mafia. The Chicago outfit would never again regain the power it had under his leadership, and the organization's influence in the city slowly faded in the years that followed. Albert Anastasia, known as the Executioner, was one of the most feared and notorious figures in the history of New York's organized crime scene. As the head of the Murder, Inc. operation and a high-ranking member of the Gambino family, Anastasia became synonymous with violence and brutal killings. His rise to power was marked by ruthlessness, and his role in carrying out executions for other mafia bosses earned him a reputation for being one of the most efficient hitmen in the criminal underworld. However, despite his dominance in the mafia, Anastasia's story ultimately ended in betrayal, a bitter irony for a man whose career was built on delivering death to others. Born in Italy in 1902, Anastasia emigrated to the United States as a young man settling in Brooklyn. He quickly found his way into the world of organized crime, joining the Genovese crime family. Anastasia's early criminal activities included petty theft, extortion, and operating in the bootlegging business during Prohibition. However, it was his proficiency with violence that set him apart from other mobsters. As he moved up through the ranks of the Genovese family, he became known for carrying out killings on behalf of the family's bosses. In the early 1930s, Anastasia's criminal empire expanded when he began working for Murder, Inc., a notorious group of hitmen for hire. Murder, Inc. was an assassination squad that carried out executions for various mafia families across the United States. especially targeting people who had betrayed the mafia or were seen as threats to the organization. Anastasia's role within the group earned him the nickname the Executioner due to his efficiency in carrying out murders. He was known for being cold, methodical, and fearless, making him one of the most feared men in the mafia. Anastasia's rise to power continued as he became closely aligned with Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the boss who restructured the five families of New York and created the Commission. Anastasia's brutal reputation made him a valuable asset to Luciano and his allies. He played a key role in helping Luciano secure control over the Gambino family and was later promoted to the position of boss of the family's operations. Anastasia's involvement in the Murder Inc. operation allowed him to maintain a tight grip on the criminal world, and his leadership was marked by violent retribution against anyone who dared to challenge the family. However, Anastasia's violent methods also earned him enemies within the mafia. His tendency to use violence and murder as a way to solve problems created friction between him and other mobsters. He made numerous enemies within the five families, and his violent tactics were seen as excessive even for the world of organized crime. Despite his power, Anastasia's actions alienated many in the mafia, and his brutal methods became a source of concern for both his allies and his rivals. Anastasia's downfall began in the 1950s, when the dynamics of the mafia world started to change. The growing influence of Vito Genovese and the increasing shift in power toward more diplomatic leaders marked the end of Anastasia's reign. As he grew older, Anastasia became increasingly paranoid, believing that those around him were plotting against him. His suspicions were not unfounded. His own underboss, Gambino family's Carlo Gambino, began to challenge his authority and maneuvered to take control of the family. The final blow came on October 25, 1957, when Anastasia was assassinated in a barbershop at the Park Sheraton Hotel in New York. Anastasia, who had always been fearless in his dealings, was sitting in a barber's chair when two gunmen entered the shop and opened fire. He was shot multiple times, and the killers fled the scene without leaving a trace. The murder was carried out in broad daylight, a shocking and brazen act of violence that shocked the mafia world. Anastasia's murder was widely believed to have been orchestrated by Carlo Gambino, who had long coveted control of the Gambino family. Gambino's carefully orchestrated plan to eliminate Anastasia once and for all left the Gambino family under his control. The hit was part of a broader power struggle within the mafia, and Anastasia's death allowed Gambino to seize power in what many saw as a strategic and calculated move. Gambino's rise to power was marked by his more calculated, low-key approach, contrasting sharply with Anastasia's violent and volatile leadership style. The aftermath of Anastasia's death left the Gambino family firmly under Gambino's control, and he would go on to lead the family for several decades. However, the assassination itself raised questions about loyalty, power, and betrayal within the mafia world. Anastasia's murder, while seemingly a calculated act of revenge, was also a reminder of the brutal nature of the mafia. Even the most powerful men in the criminal world could be brought down by those closest to them. Anastasia's legacy is a mixed one. He was a powerful mobster, a ruthless hitman, and an effective leader. However, his reliance on violence and his eventual betrayal by those he trusted left him vulnerable. The way he met his end serves as a poignant reminder of the dangers of unchecked power in the mafia world, where loyalty is often fleeting and betrayal is an ever-present threat. Albert Anastasia, known as the Mad Hatter, due to his terrifying reputation for violence and ruthlessness, was one of the most notorious figures in the American mafia. As the head of the Anastasia crime family, he was feared by both rivals and allies for his ability to eliminate anyone who stood in his way. However, it was his bloody downfall that would cement his name in the annals of organized crime history. Born in Sicily in 1902, Anastasia came to the United States in the early 1920s. He quickly became involved in the world of organized crime, working for the Genovese crime family, then known as the Masseria family. His early involvement in criminal activities included bootlegging during Prohibition, which would later become a primary source of wealth and power for the mafia. Anastasia was known for his efficiency in dealing with rivals, particularly in carrying out hits for his boss, Salvatore Maranzano, one of the top figures in the New York Mafia. The turning point in Anastasia's life came when Salvatore Maranzano was murdered in 1931 as part of the power struggle between Maranzano's faction and the rising Lucky Luciano group. Luciano's victory in that conflict reshaped the mafia landscape and led to the reorganization of the five families into a more centralized structure. Anastasia, a loyal ally of Luciano, found himself in a prominent position. He was eventually appointed as the head of the Anastasia crime family, and by the mid-1940s, the family was deeply involved in loan sharking, illegal gambling, drug trafficking, and other profitable rackets across the northeastern United States. As the boss of the Anastasia family, Anastasia quickly earned a reputation for brutality. He was responsible for running a feared group of enforcers who carried out a series of murders and extortions. He took his job as the mafia's executioner seriously, ensuring that no one could challenge his authority. He built his empire with an iron fist, eliminating rivals through quick and violent actions. He was behind the creation of Murder, Inc., a notorious group of mobsters that carried out hits on behalf of mafia families across the U.S., specializing in murder for hire. By the 1950s, Anastasia's reputation had grown beyond the New York Mafia and reached national infamy. His personal life, however, was filled with contradictions. While he ran a violent criminal empire, he was known to maintain a more refined public image, often seen in elegant suits, attending high society events, and rubbing elbows with influential figures. His ability to keep a low profile while running such a brutal operation made him nearly untouchable in the eyes of law enforcement. He lived a life of luxury, but was always one wrong move away from collapse. However, Anastasia's position at the top would not last forever. His growing influence and his violent tendencies alienated some of the more powerful figures in the mafia. He made many enemies, both within his own family and in rival factions, and his willingness to use brute force and terror to achieve his goals eventually led to his downfall. One of the most significant factors in his demise was his conflict with Carlo Gambino, the head of the Gambino crime family, and other rival factions within the five families. Gambino, in particular, had long been a thorn in Anastasia's side. While Anastasia had earned his reputation through his ruthlessness and violent methods, Gambino preferred a more calculated and diplomatic approach to running the mafia. This difference in leadership styles created friction between the two men. Gambino, along with other members of the mafia, began to plot against Anastasia, seeing him as a liability to the family's future. By 1957, the mafia landscape had shifted, and Anastasia's position as boss had become increasingly tenuous. His constant use of violence had alienated many of his allies, and the increasing pressure from law enforcement made it more difficult to maintain his grip on power. Meanwhile, Gambino was quietly building alliances within the family and beyond, positioning himself as the natural successor to Anastasia. On October 25, 1957, Anastasia was assassinated in one of the most daring and public mob killings of the 20th century. The hit took place in the Park Sheraton Hotel, located in the heart of New York City, in a barbershop frequented by mafia members and businessmen. Anastasia had been in the chair, unaware that his life was about to end. Two men entered the barbershop and opened fire on Anastasia, shooting him several times in the head and chest. The killers then swiftly fled the scene, leaving Anastasia's lifeless body in the chair. It was a professional hit, a classic example of how the mafia handled threats to their power. The assassination was a direct hit by Carlo Gambino, who had orchestrated the entire murder. Gambino's decision to remove Anastasia from power was part of a broader strategy to take control of the Anastasia family. The murder was not only a way to eliminate a rival, but also a demonstration of Gambino's growing influence. With Anastasia gone, Gambino quickly seized control of the family, and he would go on to rule the Gambino crime family with an iron fist, becoming one of the most powerful mob bosses in the history of organized crime. Anastasia's death marked the end of an era for the Anastasia crime family, which eventually merged into the Gambino family. The murder also had broader implications for the mafia, as it signaled the increasing willingness of mafia bosses to eliminate their rivals in increasingly public and brutal ways. Anastasia's life and death are a testament to the violence and betrayal that are ever present in the world of organized crime, where power is only ever temporary and constantly up for grabs. Anastasia's legacy, while short-lived, is a reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition in the mafia. His violent reign was one of domination and fear, but it was ultimately his own arrogance and willingness to challenge the traditional order of the mafia that led to his fall. His violent methods and ruthless tactics were his greatest strengths and ultimately the causes of his undoing. Paul Castellano's story is one of ambition, power, and ultimately betrayal, a classic tale in the world of the mafia. As the head of the Gambino crime family, one of the most powerful crime syndicates in New York, Castellano had it all: wealth, influence, and control. Yet, despite his commanding position, Castellano's downfall was swift and violent, culminating in his assassination outside a Manhattan steakhouse. His death not only marked the end of his reign, but also opened the door for one of the most infamous mob bosses in history, John Gotti, to rise to power. Born in Brooklyn in 1915, Castellano came from humble beginnings. He was the son of Italian immigrants and grew up in a neighborhood deeply entrenched in the criminal underworld. From a young age, Castellano was drawn to the world of organized crime, eventually becoming involved with the Gambino crime family in the 1950s. As a trusted member of the family, Castellano quickly rose through the ranks, earning a reputation as a shrewd businessman and ruthless enforcer. In 1976, Carlo Gambino, the powerful boss of the Gambino family, died of natural causes, and Castellano was chosen to succeed him. Unlike Gambino, who had built the family through a mix of violence and strategic diplomacy, Castellano preferred to run his operations like a legitimate business. He sought to distance the Gambino family from the street-level violence that had characterized its operations in the past. Castellano was more focused on investing in legitimate businesses, including construction, trucking, and even real estate. He ran the family's operations from behind the scenes, relying on intermediaries to carry out the more illicit activities, such as drug trafficking, loan sharking, and racketeering. While Castellano's approach was more businesslike and less violent than his predecessors, it made him enemies both within the family and beyond. His desire to steer the Gambino family into legitimate business ventures alienated many of the family's traditionalists who saw the mob's power as rooted in the old ways, brutality and violence. Castellano's focus on expanding the family's legitimate business interests also led to tensions with other mafia families, who believed that his actions threatened the balance of power within the mafia world. One of the most significant sources of tension came from John Gotti, a rising star in the Gambino family. Gotti, who had earned a reputation as a ruthless and violent figure, believed that Castellano was too focused on the business side of things and was distancing the family from its mafia roots. Gotti, along with other disaffected members of the family, grew increasingly frustrated with Castellano's leadership. Gotti, who had close ties to the family's underworld operations, was seen as the more charismatic and street-savvy leader, while Castellano was seen as aloof and disconnected from the men who did the dirty work. Tensions came to a head in 1985, when Castellano was assassinated outside of Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. The hit was a bold and public move, a clear message that no one in the mafia was untouchable, not even the boss of the Gambino family. The assassination was orchestrated by none other than John Gotti, who had grown tired of Castellano's leadership and saw an opportunity to seize control of the family. Gotti and his associates waited for Castellano outside the restaurant, where they shot him in a brazen hit that was witnessed by many. Castellano's death marked a turning point for the Gambino family, and Gotti quickly took over as boss. Gotti's rise to power was swift, but it was not without its consequences. While he had orchestrated the murder of Paul Castellano, Gotti had now inherited a family divided. He had made powerful enemies within the mafia, and his rise to power was seen by many as a challenge to the traditional mafia code of loyalty and honor. However, Gotti's ruthlessness and ability to manipulate the media turned him into one of the most iconic mob bosses in history. His subsequent trial and acquittal in multiple high-profile cases cemented his reputation as the Teflon Don, a nickname given to him for his to avoid conviction despite overwhelming evidence against him. Castellano's murder was a pivotal moment in the history of the American mafia. His death not only removed a powerful boss from the equation, but also set the stage for Gotti's reign as one of the most infamous figures in organized crime. It was a reminder of the violence and treachery that lay at the heart of the mafia world, where loyalty is fleeting and power is always in flux. Castellano's death was the result of both his inability to adapt to the changing dynamics of the mafia and his alienation from the men who had once supported him. The story of Paul Castellano is one of power, ambition, and ultimately betrayal. His leadership of the Gambino family marked a significant shift in the mafia's operations, moving from violence and intimidation to a more business-oriented approach. However, his refusal to adhere to the old mafia code ultimately led to his downfall. Castellano's murder was a brutal reminder of the ever-present danger in the criminal world, where the price of power is often paid in blood. Vito Genovese's story is one of ruthless ambition, betrayal, and violent power struggles that shaped the landscape of the mafia in America. As one of the most influential mob bosses of the 20th century, Genovese's rise to power in the Genovese crime family marked the beginning of a new era in the mafia's operations. However, his drive to become the supreme boss of the mafia led to internal strife, violence, and a tragic downfall that would eventually cement his name in history. Born in Italy in 1897, Genovese immigrated to the United States as a child, settling in New York City. As a young man, he became involved in criminal activities, working his way through the ranks of the Masseria crime family. Genovese's early years in the world of organized crime were marked by his violent nature and his cunning ability to climb the criminal ladder. He was eventually recruited by Lucky Luciano, the future mastermind behind the restructuring of the mafia in New York. Genovese's relationship with Luciano was crucial to his rise to power. In 1931, when Luciano orchestrated the murder of Joe Masseria, he effectively took control of the mafia in New York, creating the commission to govern the 5 families. Genovese, a trusted ally of Luciano, became one of the central figures in the new mafia structure. However, Genovese was not content with being a subordinate. His ambition to rule the entire mafia led him to betray Luciano, and his actions ultimately caused the fragmentation of the powerful alliances Luciano had worked to establish. In 1937, Genovese made a bold and dangerous move. After Luciano was imprisoned on charges of prostitution, Genovese saw an opportunity to seize power. He plotted the murder of his boss, Salvatore Maranzano, who had become the boss of bosses after Masseria's death. Genovese's betrayal of Maranzano marked the beginning of a violent power struggle within the mafia. Genovese's ability to execute such a dramatic and risky move solidified his reputation as a force to be reckoned with, but it also set the stage for his eventual downfall. By the 1940s, Genovese had successfully taken control of the Genovese family and was involved in an array of illegal enterprises, including drug trafficking, money laundering, loan sharking, and gambling rackets. He sought to expand the family's influence beyond New York, and his connections with other mafia families allowed him to control vast territories. Under his leadership, the Genovese family became one of the most powerful factions in the mafia, rivaling even the Gambino family in terms of its criminal operations. However, Genovese's hunger for power did not end with his control of the Genovese family. By the early 1950s, he began plotting to become the supreme boss of the mafia, aiming to take control of the entire American underworld. This ambition led him into direct conflict with other powerful mob figures, most notably Frank Costello, the boss of the Lucchese crime family. Genovese sought to remove Costello from power, believing that he could wield more influence if he controlled the entire mafia network. In 1957, Genovese ordered an assassination attempt on Costello, which resulted in Costello's survival but marked the beginning of Genovese's violent ascent to the top. Costello's retreat from the public eye following the attack allowed Genovese to seize control of the Lucchese crime family, further solidifying his position as one of the most dangerous figures in the mafia world. However, Genovese's actions were not without consequences. His constant scheming and betrayals began to alienate key allies within the 5 families and the mafia world at large. By the late 1950s, Genovese's life took a dramatic turn. In 1959, he was arrested and convicted for his role in the drug trade, a charge that led to a lengthy prison sentence. Though Genovese was able to continue controlling his criminal empire from behind bars, the arrest marked the end of his reign as the undisputed boss of the Genovese family. His inability to maintain control over the family and his increasing legal troubles made him a liability to the mafia. While Anthony "Tony Ducks" Corallo was able to assume control of the family temporarily, Genovese's influence was ultimately reduced, and the family's operations began to fragment. Despite his declining health, Genovese continued to exert influence from prison, but his life was marked by growing isolation. As his power waned, Genovese's once formidable criminal empire began to collapse. The FBI and other law enforcement agencies had spent years targeting him and his family, and with his arrest, his grip on the mafia world weakened considerably. Genovese's death in 1969, while serving his sentence in federal prison, marked the end of an era for the Genovese crime family. His death left a power vacuum that would be filled by other ambitious mobsters, but his legacy as a mastermind of organized crime continued to be felt. Though his leadership was marked by violence, manipulation, and betrayal, Genovese's role in reshaping the mafia world cannot be understated. He was one of the key architects of the modern mafia and played a central role in the history of organized crime in America. The Genovese family would continue to exist, but it was never quite the same after Genovese's death. His influence on the criminal underworld was undeniable, but his inability to maintain control of the family after his imprisonment and his eventual death left the organization fractured. Genovese's story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the consequences of attempting to rise above the established mafia order. His ruthless climb to power, his constant plotting, and his eventual downfall highlight the volatile and treacherous nature of organized crime. John Gotti, known as the Teflon Don, is arguably one of the most famous figures in the history of organized crime. His story is one of ambition, ruthlessness, and survival in the cutthroat world of the mafia. Gotti's rise to power and his ability to repeatedly evade conviction made him a household name in America. However, his eventual downfall came not just from his criminal activities, but from his increasingly public persona, his arrogance, and the internal struggles within the Gambino crime family that he ruled with an iron fist. Gotti was born in 1940 in Brooklyn, New York, to a poor Italian immigrant family. Like many men in his neighborhood, Gotti was drawn into the world of organized crime at a young age. By his late teens, he was involved in petty crime, petty theft, and street-level violence. Gotti's big break came when he joined the Gambino crime family under the mentorship of Paul Castellano, the boss of the family. Gotti quickly made a name for himself as a tough, calculating figure who was willing to use violence to get what he wanted. Gotti's rise through the ranks was rapid. He quickly earned the trust of Castellano and became involved in a number of profitable ventures, including drug trafficking, loan sharking, extortion, and illegal gambling. He was known for his charisma and his ability to inspire loyalty in his men, making him a natural leader within the family. However, Gotti's relationship with Castellano was complicated. While Gotti was close to Castellano, he believed that Castellano was weak and not aggressive enough to maintain the family's power. Castellano's cautious and somewhat distant leadership style clashed with Gotti's more direct and ruthless approach. The tension between Gotti and Castellano came to a head in 1985, when Castellano was murdered outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. Gotti, along with his associates, had orchestrated the hit, which was a shocking and public act of violence that set the stage for Gotti's ascension to the throne of the Gambino crime family. The murder of Castellano was a pivotal moment in mafia history, as it marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Gotti's violent but strategic move effectively wiped out the leadership of the Gambino family and allowed him to take control. Once in power, Gotti made sure to solidify his position as the boss. He quickly took over the Gambino family's operations, expanding the family's interests in the drug trade, money laundering, racketeering, and gambling. Gotti, who was known for his flashy lifestyle and public persona, became a media sensation. His arrogance, confidence, and flamboyant style made him the face of organized crime in America. He became known as the Teflon Don, a nickname given to him due to his ability to avoid conviction in several high-profile trials. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him in multiple cases, Gotti was acquitted in court due to his intimidation tactics and his ability to manipulate the legal system. He was known for witness tampering and bribing jurors, ensuring that his cases never made it past trial. His success in evading conviction only bolstered his public image and solidified his reputation as one of the most powerful mob bosses in America. Gotti became so popular that he was treated like a celebrity by the media, and his court cases became a public spectacle. However, Gotti's arrogance and desire for the public spotlight would ultimately be his undoing. His increasing public visibility, combined with his disregard for the traditional mafia code of silence, made him a target for both law enforcement and rival mafia figures. His obsession with the media and his willingness to flaunt his wealth and power left him vulnerable to law enforcement scrutiny. It wasn't long before federal agents began building a case against him, focusing on his family's racketeering activities and his involvement in a series of murders. In 1992, Gotti was finally convicted of murder, racketeering, and conspiracy in a landmark trial that was widely regarded as the most significant blow to the mafia in decades. This conviction came as a result of Sammy the Bull Gravano, Gotti's underboss, turning state's witness and testifying against him. Gravano's testimony was a major turning point in the case, as it exposed Gotti's direct involvement in the murder of Paul Castellano and other crimes committed by the Gambino family. Gravano's cooperation with the government was one of the most significant betrayals in mafia history, and it sealed Gotti's fate. Gotti was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His conviction marked the end of his reign as the boss of the Gambino family, but it did not mark the end of his influence. Even while behind bars, Gotti continued to have supporters within the mafia, and his name remained synonymous with the mafia's power and influence. His story, however, is a tragic one. Gotti went from being the untouchable kingpin of the Gambino family to a man whose name became a symbol of the downfall of the American mafia. Gotti's legacy is one of both triumph and tragedy. While he was successful in building one of the most powerful mafia families in history, his arrogance and desire for the limelight ultimately led to his downfall. His inability to remain in the shadows and his disregard for the traditional mafia code of secrecy left him vulnerable to law enforcement and to his own people. Gotti's story serves as a reminder of the dangers of excessive ambition, as well as the inevitable nature of betrayal in the world of organized crime. After his conviction, Gotti spent the remaining years of his life in ADX Florence, a high-security federal prison in Colorado. He died in 2002 from throat cancer, a shadow of the man who had once ruled New York's underworld. His death marked the end of an era for the Gambino family, and his legacy remains one of the most significant in mafia history. The Teflon Don may have slipped through the hands of law enforcement for years, but in the end, it was his own hubris that led to his eventual demise. John Gotti's name remains etched in the annals of organized crime history, synonymous with the mafia lifestyle that defined New York's five families in the 1980s and 1990s. His rise to power, marked by cold-blooded ambition, his defiance of law enforcement, and his public persona as the untouchable mob boss, made him a legend in his own time. However, Gotti's story also serves as a cautionary tale about the fragility of power, the consequences of betrayal, and the inevitable downfall that awaits those who refuse to adhere to the mafia's traditional codes. While his flashy style and near-mythical status as the Teflon Don earned him fame, it was his ultimate conviction and fall from grace that sealed his place in the dark legacy of organized crime. Gotti was born in 1940 in Brooklyn, New York, to an immigrant Italian family. From a young age, he was exposed to the criminal world, where he would eventually find his calling. By his late teens, Gotti had already begun his journey through the underworld, working for the Gambino family under the tutelage of notorious boss Paul Castellano. Gotti was known for his violent tendencies and his ability to make ruthless decisions, which allowed him to rise through the ranks of the family. His rise, however, was not without controversy. The tipping point in Gotti's career came in 1985, when he orchestrated the murder of Paul Castellano, the Gambino family boss. Castellano's murder, carried out in a brazen assassination outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan, shocked the mafia world. Castellano's removal from power was not just an act of violence, but a carefully calculated move by Gotti, who had grown frustrated with Castellano's leadership. Castellano's focus on business ventures and his failure to involve the lower ranks of the family in key decision-making made him unpopular among the more violent, street-savvy members of the Gambino family, including Gotti. In a daring power grab, Gotti had Castellano killed and immediately took over the Gambino family. After Castellano's death, Gotti took control of the family's operations with a mix of charm, ruthlessness, and strategic thinking. He revitalized the family's criminal enterprises, bringing in millions from drug trafficking, gambling, loan sharking, and extortion. Gotti's leadership style was different from his predecessors. Instead of operating in the shadows like traditional mob bosses, he relished in the limelight. His desire to be seen as a celebrity mobster made him stand out. Gotti was a man of style, often seen in tailored suits, a well-groomed appearance, and a brash, charismatic personality. His media presence and public speeches only enhanced his reputation. He became the face of the mafia and, in many ways, the personification of the criminal underworld's glamour. Gotti's public persona, along with his close ties to powerful figures, ensured his continued dominance over the Gambino family. His rise was not without internal conflict, though. The Colombo crime family and other rival factions within the five families were skeptical of Gotti's leadership, believing that his open flaunting of power would attract unwanted attention from law enforcement. Gotti, however, was a master manipulator, using bribes, threats, and strategic alliances to maintain control over his family. His loyalty to the Gambino family was unquestionable, and his power was absolute, until the law finally caught up with him. Gotti's legendary status as the Teflon Don was born during his trials. In 1986, he was charged with multiple crimes, including murder, racketeering, and conspiracy. Despite overwhelming evidence against him, Gotti escaped conviction in each case, thanks to his manipulation of the jury system and his use of intimidation tactics to silence witnesses. Gotti was untouchable, and for a time, he seemed invincible. His ability to avoid conviction, despite the best efforts of law enforcement, earned him the nickname Teflon Don, because the charges against him seemed to slide off, just like Teflon does with food. The turning point came in 1992, when Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, Gotti's underboss, turned state's witness and agreed to testify against him. Gravano's decision to cooperate with the government was a massive blow to Gotti, as it exposed the inner workings of the Gambino family and provided key evidence that ultimately led to Gotti's conviction. Gravano's testimony was instrumental in securing Gotti's conviction on charges of racketeering and murder, and in 1992, Gotti was sentenced to life in prison. Gotti's conviction and subsequent imprisonment marked the end of an era for the Gambino family. Gotti, once the undisputed king of New York's criminal underworld, was now a prisoner. His reign had been marked by his ability to avoid conviction through bribes, intimidation, and witness tampering. However, his eventual conviction demonstrated the limits of his power and the fragility of the mafia empire he had built. Gotti's downfall was not just the result of law enforcement's relentless pursuit of him, but also his own hubris and desire for the spotlight. His public persona, which had once made him a symbol of mafia power, ultimately played a role in his demise. John Gotti spent the remainder of his life in federal prison. Despite his infamous reputation, he was not the same man who had once ruled the streets of New York. Gotti's time behind bars was spent in isolation, away from the power and luxury he had once enjoyed. He died in 2002 from throat cancer, a sad and anticlimactic end to the life of one of the most famous mobsters in history. His death marked the end of an era for the Gambino family, and his legacy remains a cautionary tale for those who seek to rise to power in the world of organized crime. The life of John Gotti serves as a reminder of the volatility of power in the mafia. His rise to prominence was fueled by violence, manipulation, and strategic alliances, but his eventual downfall came as a result of his greed, publicity-seeking behavior, and betrayal by his closest allies. Gotti's story underscores the inevitable corruption that comes with absolute power and the relentless pursuit of glory in the criminal underworld. Sammy the Bull Gravano is one of the most infamous figures in the history of the American mafia. His rise through the ranks of the Gambino crime family, his violent criminal career, and his eventual defection from the mob to cooperate with the FBI against his former boss, John Gotti, marked a dramatic shift in the power dynamics within the mafia. Gravano's story is a chilling tale of loyalty, betrayal, and the ultimate cost of survival in the world of organized crime. His decision to testify against Gotti not only dismantled the Gambino family, but also cemented his status as one of the most significant turncoats in mafia history. Born in 1945 in Brooklyn, New York, to Italian immigrant parents, Gravano grew up in a working-class neighborhood where crime was an everyday part of life. Like many of his peers, he was drawn into the world of organized crime at a young age. Gravano's early involvement in criminal activities included petty theft, extortion, and later drug trafficking. His connections to the Gambino crime family came when he met John Gotti, who quickly took Gravano under his wing. Gravano's ability to commit violent acts without hesitation made him a valuable asset to the Gambino family. He became involved in the family's murder-for-hire operations, and his reputation as a cold-blooded killer grew quickly. Gravano was instrumental in carrying out hits for the family, and his ability to execute orders without emotion earned him respect and fear within the mafia world. He also took part in racketeering, extortion, and drug trafficking, all of which made him an essential player in the family's criminal empire. By the 1980s, Gravano had become one of the Gambino family's most trusted soldiers. He worked closely with John Gotti, who was known for his flamboyant style and desire for power. Gotti and Gravano formed a strong alliance, with Gravano serving as Gotti's underboss. While Gotti thrived in the spotlight, Gravano preferred to work in the shadows, orchestrating murders and managing the day-to-day operations of the family. The relationship between the two men was symbiotic, with Gotti's ambition for power and Gravano's violent efficiency fueling the family's dominance in New York. Despite his loyalty to Gotti and his rise within the Gambino family, Gravano began to grow disillusioned with the way things were run. Gotti's constant flaunting of the family's power and his increasing public visibility created tensions within the organization. Gravano, ever the pragmatist, saw the risks of drawing too much attention and believed that Gotti's behavior was jeopardizing the family's ability to operate without interference from law enforcement. The breaking point came when Gotti orchestrated the murder of Paul Castellano, the boss of the Gambino family, in 1985. While the hit on Castellano allowed Gotti to assume control of the family, it also set in motion a series of events that would unravel everything. The killing of Castellano and Gotti's rise to power led to increasing internal conflict within the family. Gotti's inability to maintain a low profile, combined with his growing ego, made him a target within the mafia. Gravano, who had always been a calculating and ruthless operator, began to see the writing on the wall. He realized that Gotti's influence was no longer as secure as it once had been, and that his own future in the family was tied to Gotti's success or failure. In the late 1980s, federal investigations into the Gambino family began to heat up. Gotti's numerous criminal activities, including murder, racketeering, and his role in the family's illegal operations, drew the attention of the FBI. Despite the evidence against him, Gotti managed to avoid conviction in multiple trials, earning him the nickname the Teflon Don due to his ability to escape conviction despite overwhelming evidence. However, Gotti's victory in the courtroom came at a cost. His high-profile trials made him a target for law enforcement, and they began investigating his associates more aggressively. In 1991, after a lengthy investigation, the FBI managed to secure the cooperation of Sammy Gravano. The federal authorities offered Gravano a deal that would grant him a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony against Gotti. Gravano's decision to betray Gotti and testify against him in court was a turning point in mafia history. Gravano provided detailed testimony about the Gambino family's operations, including murder, drug trafficking, and racketeering, and his cooperation was instrumental in securing Gotti's conviction on multiple charges. Gravano's decision to turn on his former boss was driven by a combination of self-preservation and a desire for a reduced sentence. Gravano had spent years in prison for various crimes and had grown tired of the constant danger that came with his life in the mafia. The realization that Gotti's reign was coming to an end made Gravano's decision easier. His testimony helped the federal government dismantle the Gambino family, and Gotti was sentenced to life in prison for his role in organized crime. Gravano's cooperation with law enforcement came at a significant cost. While he was granted a reduced sentence, he was forced to enter witness protection and sever ties with his past life. Despite his cooperation, Gravano's involvement in the mafia would forever follow him, and his name became synonymous with betrayal. After serving only a few years in witness protection, Gravano was eventually released from prison and began a new life. However, his life outside of the witness protection program was fraught with challenges, including a return to the underworld with his involvement in drug trafficking. Gravano's story serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of living a life of crime, loyalty, and betrayal. His rise and fall within the Gambino family were marked by violence, ambition, and an unrelenting desire for power. However, it was his eventual decision to betray the very system he had built that ultimately led to his downfall. Gravano's legacy, while undeniably significant in the history of organized crime, is one of tragic consequences, as his decisions led to the destruction of the family he had worked so hard to build. Paul Castellano, the boss of the Gambino crime family in New York, was a man who epitomized the classic mafia boss, ruthless, calculating, and focused on expanding his criminal empire. However, his leadership style, which was more business-oriented than his predecessors, and his perceived weakness by some of his underlings, would lead to his brutal and public assassination. Castellano's life and death highlight the complexity of mafia leadership, where ambition, loyalty, and betrayal create volatile power struggles that are often decided by bloodshed. Born in New York City in 1915, Castellano came from an immigrant family, and his early life was marked by poverty. However, like many others who grew up in the Italian-American neighborhoods of New York, he was drawn to organized crime as a way out of hardship. Castellano's early criminal activities involved petty crimes, but he quickly rose through the ranks of the Gambino family, one of New York's most powerful mafia families. Over time, he developed a reputation as a savvy businessman, using his connections to racketeer and engage in illegal gambling, extortion, and drug trafficking. In the 1970s, Castellano became the boss of the Gambino family after the death of Carlo Gambino, the family's longtime leader. Carlo Gambino's death marked a turning point for the Gambino crime family, as the leadership passed to Castellano, who had been the family's underboss. Unlike Gambino, who had maintained a relatively low profile while running the family's criminal enterprises, Castellano sought to modernize the family's operations. He believed in controlling the family's interests through legitimate businesses such as construction, waste management, and real estate, and he sought to expand the family's influence into more sophisticated financial activities. While Castellano's strategy was focused on wealth accumulation and legitimizing the family's operations, his methods alienated many of his underlings, who were more accustomed to the violent, street-level operations that had been the foundation of the Gambino family. Castellano's reluctance to engage in the traditional mafia violence and his preference for quieter, business-oriented dealings made him unpopular with some of his more aggressive subordinates, including John Gotti. At the heart of the Gambino family's internal strife was Gotti, a rising star within the family who was known for his violent nature, street smarts, and ambition. Gotti was not happy with Castellano's approach to running the family. He believed that Castellano's business-minded focus was weakening the family's power and influence. Gotti also resented Castellano's distance from the street-level operations and his refusal to allow the more aggressive members of the family to thrive. Tensions came to a head in 1985 when Castellano's control over the Gambino family was threatened by Gotti's growing influence. Gotti, seeing an opportunity to take over the family, began plotting against Castellano, believing that he could run the family in a way that was both more profitable and more violent. The final straw came when Castellano refused to promote Gotti to the position of underboss, despite Gotti's growing support within the family. Gotti saw this as an affront to his power and influence, and he began to secretly align himself with other disgruntled members of the family. The plot to kill Castellano was set into motion in December 1985, when Gotti and his allies decided that the time had come to remove Castellano from power. The assassination was carried out outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan, one of the most infamous mafia hits in history. Castellano and his underboss, Thomas Bilotti, were ambushed by a group of Gotti's men while they were entering the restaurant. The hit was swift and efficient, and both Castellano and Bilotti were killed in a public display of violence. The assassination sent shockwaves through the mafia world, and Gotti immediately seized control of the Gambino family. The murder of Paul Castellano was a turning point for both the Gambino crime family and John Gotti. Gotti's rise to power was swift, and he quickly became the new boss of the Gambino family. He made his mark by turning the family into one of the most influential criminal organizations in the country, taking control of drug trafficking, illegal gambling, and extortion. Gotti's ambition and willingness to use violence to assert his authority made him one of the most powerful and feared figures in the mafia. His charismatic personality and his ability to evade law enforcement earned him the nickname the Teflon Don, as charges against him consistently failed to stick. However, Castellano's death marked the beginning of the end for Gotti's reign. While Gotti was able to maintain control of the Gambino family for several years, his desire for attention, his lack of respect for traditional mafia secrecy, and his eventual conviction for murder and racketeering led to his downfall. Gotti was eventually convicted in 1992, in part due to the testimony of his former underboss, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, who cooperated with authorities and testified against Gotti. Gravano's betrayal marked the end of Gotti's criminal empire, and he was sentenced to life in prison, where he would die in 2002. Paul Castellano's legacy, though overshadowed by the violent way in which he was removed from power, remains an important part of the Gambino family's history. While his leadership was marked by a desire to modernize the family's operations, it was ultimately his failure to maintain loyalty and respect within his own ranks that led to his downfall. Castellano's story is a reminder of the dangers of being a boss who seeks to change the system without fully understanding the internal dynamics of the mafia. His death at the hands of his own men showed that even in the mafia, where loyalty is considered sacred, power can be easily taken by those who are willing to use violence and betrayal to achieve their goals. Angelo "Gyp" DiCarlo, an infamous figure in the world of organized crime, is perhaps one of the lesser-known mobsters whose tragic fate highlights the fragility of loyalty and the dangerous alliances formed in the world of the mafia. DiCarlo's rise through the criminal ranks, his closeness to the notorious Gambino family, and his involvement in several high-profile criminal activities made him a figure to be reckoned with. However, DiCarlo's story serves as a cautionary tale about the inherent danger of ambition and the ever-present threat of betrayal in the underworld. DiCarlo's early years were typical of a young man growing up in New York's criminal world. Born in New York City in 1930, he became involved in the mafia's activities at a young age, working his way into the orbit of the Gambino crime family. His early criminal activities involved extortion, loan sharking, and robbery, typical crimes for someone trying to make a name for themselves in the underworld. DiCarlo quickly became known for his violent nature and his ability to carry out orders without hesitation, earning him the trust of the Gambino family's leadership. What set DiCarlo apart from many others in the world of organized crime was his personal connection to the Gambino family, particularly with John Gotti and the family's underboss, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano. These relationships helped solidify DiCarlo's position within the Gambino family as he quickly moved up the ranks due to his effectiveness in running operations and eliminating threats. His ruthless efficiency and ability to collect debts and enforce loyalty made him a key figure in the Gambino family's racketeering activities. However, as DiCarlo's power grew, so did his arrogance and ambition. He started to believe that he could operate independently of Gotti and Gravano, seeing himself as a potential power player within the Gambino family. DiCarlo, however, was not a figure who could be easily controlled. His growing ambition, combined with his sense of entitlement, eventually caused him to challenge the established order within the family. By the late 1980s, DiCarlo's relationship with the Gambino family began to deteriorate. While he had previously been trusted as an enforcer and right-hand man to Gotti, he now saw himself as a potential rival to Gotti's leadership. The final straw came when DiCarlo's association with other criminal figures and his increasing involvement in independent rackets put him at odds with Gotti's vision for the Gambino family. Gotti, who had already shown his ability to eliminate rivals, saw DiCarlo as a threat to his control of the family. Gotti's ambition and willingness to remove any threat to his leadership made DiCarlo's survival increasingly unlikely. The downfall of DiCarlo came swiftly and violently in 1989, when he was murdered in a hit ordered by Gotti. The circumstances surrounding his death were clouded in secrecy, but it is widely believed that Gotti, fearing DiCarlo's growing ambition and potential betrayal, decided to act. DiCarlo's murder was carried out in the coldest of fashions. He was shot multiple times, likely in a professional hit designed to send a message to anyone who would challenge Gotti's authority. DiCarlo's death marked the end of an era for the Gambino family. His murder was a stark reminder of the dangers of ambition in the world of the mafia. While Gotti's rise to power was marked by violence and betrayal, DiCarlo's fate demonstrated the ruthless nature of the underworld, where even the most trusted lieutenants could be discarded once they no longer served their purpose. His death also highlighted the growing tension within the Gambino family during the late 1980s, when power struggles and rivalries were becoming more prevalent, as Gotti's leadership was increasingly questioned by those within the organization. DiCarlo's murder was also significant because it reflected the changing dynamics of the mafia world. As the FBI cracked down on mafia operations and the older generation of mobsters began to fade, a younger, more ruthless breed of criminals took over. The old mafia code of loyalty and respect began to break down, and figures like Gotti and Gravano showed that in the modern era, the mafia was no longer about family, it was about power. DiCarlo, who had once been trusted and respected, was ultimately seen as expendable in a world where survival often meant eliminating any threat to leadership. While DiCarlo's story may not be as well known as that of John Gotti or other mafia figures, his tragic end is a powerful reminder of the brutal nature of organized crime. His rise to power, his eventual betrayal by those he trusted, and his death serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition and betrayal in the world of the mafia. DiCarlo's life and death also underscore the fragile nature of loyalty within the mafia, a world where one's value is only as strong as their ability to serve the boss, and where betrayal is often rewarded with death. Tony Spilotro's name is synonymous with violence, deception, and ultimately betrayal. As a high-ranking member of the Chicago outfit, he was an enforcer and a close associate of the notorious Gambino crime family. Spilotro's role in the mafia and his operations in Las Vegas were part of his rise to power, but his violent, erratic behavior ultimately led to his tragic downfall. His story is one of ambition, loyalty, and a ruthless pursuit of control, one that ended with a brutal and public death. Born in Chicago in 1931, Spilotro grew up in an environment steeped in crime. Like many who rose through the ranks of organized crime, he quickly became involved in petty crime, theft, and extortion. His early life mirrored that of many mobsters who, coming from difficult backgrounds, sought to make a name for themselves in the criminal underworld. Spilotro's rise came when he connected with the Chicago Outfit, a dominant mafia organization in the United States at the time. His ability to act violently and decisively made him a valuable asset to the family. By the mid-1960s, Spilotro's reputation as a ruthless enforcer began to grow. His violent nature made him one of the most feared mobsters in Chicago, and his ability to carry out hits and enforce the outfit's will on rivals was well known. His skill as a muscle man allowed him to take on more prominent roles in the family's operations, eventually earning him a position of power within the Chicago Outfit's operations in Las Vegas. It was in Las Vegas where Spilotro's ambitions really took shape. He became the key enforcer for the outfit's operations in the city, overseeing illegal gambling, extortion, and fraud. However, His activities in Vegas were not without conflict. Spilatro clashed with both rival mobsters and the law enforcement agencies that had begun to crack down on mafia activities in the city. Despite his best efforts, Spilatro found himself caught between his loyalty to the Chicago outfit and the growing tension between his violent tendencies and the more business-minded leadership of the mafia. In 1971, Spilatro was tasked with overseeing the outfit's operations in Las Vegas. His job was to ensure that the family controlled the most profitable aspects of the city's criminal enterprises, including casinos, money laundering, and the labor unions that ran the city's hotels and construction businesses. Spilatro's influence in the city grew rapidly, but his presence also led to violent turf wars with both rival gangs and even factions within the Chicago outfit itself. His violent temper and refusal to play by the rules eventually became a liability to his superiors in Chicago. The outfit, under the leadership of Tony Accardo, was beginning to shift its focus from old-school violence to more lucrative and quieter operations. Spilatro's approach, however, was firmly rooted in brutality. His propensity for murder and his lack of subtlety made him an increasingly dangerous liability, not just to rival gangsters, but to the family he worked for. The tipping point came in the 1980s, when the outfit's leadership began to view Spilatro's behavior as reckless. Spilatro's influence in Las Vegas had not only drawn attention from law enforcement, but also from rival factions within the outfit. Gambling was a lucrative business, but Spilatro's violence in dealing with disputes over territory and his inability to keep a low profile made him a growing concern. His operations, once profitable, were now seen as a liability, especially as law enforcement began cracking down on organized crime. It was 1986 when Spilatro's fall from grace became inevitable. He was invited to a meeting by Joey the Clown Lombardo, a fellow member of the Chicago outfit. Spilatro, trusting Lombardo, arrived at the meeting thinking that he was going to work out a deal or negotiate some of the tensions between the family's operations in Las Vegas. What he didn't know was that his fate had already been sealed. In a brutal double murder, Spilatro and his brother Michael were lured to a home in Indiana, where they were ambushed by the very people they considered their allies. Spilatro was beaten, tortured, and killed alongside his brother. The murder was designed to send a message to any mobster who might think they could defy the family's orders or bring unwanted attention to their operations. The aftermath of Spilatro's murder sent shockwaves through the mafia. His death marked the end of an era in the Chicago outfit's operations in Las Vegas. Spilatro had been one of the last holdouts of the older, more violent methods of running the mafia, and his murder signaled the shift toward a more business-minded approach that would come to dominate the mafia in the years following his death. The brutal way in which Spilatro was killed, along with the fact that it was ordered by his own associates, highlighted the volatility and fragility of the mafia. Loyalty, betrayal, and violence were always at the heart of the mafia's operations. But in Spilatro's case, his violent tendencies ultimately led to his tragic end. His death also symbolized the shifting dynamics within the mafia, where violence and brutality were no longer seen as viable solutions to leadership disputes. Spilatro's legacy remains as a symbol of the dangers of unchecked violence and ambition within organized crime. His rise to power was built on bloodshed and ruthlessness, but it was those same qualities that led to his downfall. As the mafia evolved into a more businesslike operation, Spilatro's willingness to use violence in public was seen as a liability, and his eventual death served as a reminder of the fragile nature of power in the criminal underworld. Frank Lucas is a name that resonates with both admiration and fear in the world of organized crime. Known for his rise to power in the heroin trade, Lucas's story is one of calculated violence, brilliant strategy, and ultimately the moral compromise that often accompanies the world of criminal empires. His rise from the slums of Harlem to becoming one of the most powerful drug lords in America was a remarkable feat. But it was also marked by betrayal, destruction, and an inevitable downfall that would see him imprisoned and shunned by the world he had once ruled. Lucas was born in 1930 in North Carolina and moved to Harlem as a young man. His initial entry into the world of crime was humble. He started as a street-level hustler, dealing with small-time robbery, burglary, and racketeering. But Harlem, in the 1960s, was a melting pot of opportunity for those who could navigate the underworld, and Lucas, like many others, saw an opportunity to carve out his own niche in the growing drug trade. Lucas's rise to prominence came through his involvement in the heroin business. At the time, African-American drug lords were not common players in the heroin trade, which had long been dominated by Italian-American and other ethnic crime syndicates. But Lucas saw a gap in the market and devised a plan to change the game. His key move was to cut out the middleman and source heroin directly from Thailand, establishing a direct pipeline that allowed him to bring the purest heroin to the streets of Harlem. By doing this, he was able to flood the market with top-quality heroin at a fraction of the cost his competitors were paying, thus giving him a monopoly over the New York heroin trade. Lucas's operation was not just based on his ability to outsmart competitors. It was also rooted in ruthless violence and fear. He employed a team of enforcers who handled his business interests with an iron fist, intimidating rivals and dealing with anyone who threatened his operation. Lucas was known for brutal retribution, ensuring that anyone who crossed him paid a steep price. He was rumored to have killed multiple people, personally overseeing executions to maintain his authority and message of dominance in the streets. What set Lucas apart from many other drug lords was his ability to operate with a certain level of discretion and sophistication. He didn't flaunt his wealth in the same way other mobsters did. He kept a relatively low profile, living in a modest home and keeping a distance from the flashier aspects of criminal life. His ability to blend in while maintaining an efficient and expansive drug network was one of the reasons his empire grew so quickly and became so powerful. Lucas controlled not just Harlem, but also had a hand in several other urban centers across the United States. However, Lucas's empire wasn't invulnerable. As his success grew, so did the attention he attracted from law enforcement. His growing influence caught the attention of the FBI, and he found himself under investigation for several years. But Lucas's connections to the police and political figures allowed him to operate for an extended period without significant interference. He had an extensive network of corrupt officials who protected him, and this network helped him avoid many of the pitfalls that led to the downfall of other criminals. But the more success he experienced, the more greed and ambition took hold of Lucas. By the 1970s, his operation was vast, and his empire had grown beyond just heroin to include other illicit activities. His focus on maintaining his criminal empire, however, started to blind him to the risks he was taking. Lucas began to surround himself with loyalists who, although devoted to him, were not always the brightest or most careful. This lack of caution ultimately led to his undoing. Lucas's arrest came in 1975 when he was finally caught by law enforcement. The FBI had spent years collecting evidence against him, and they used a combination of surveillance, undercover operations, and testimony from informants to bring him down. His downfall was swift. and he was arrested along with several members of his inner circle. Despite his earlier success in avoiding capture, Lucas could not escape the growing weight of law enforcement's efforts. During his trial, Lucas's life as a kingpin was exposed in full detail. The authorities revealed how he had smuggled heroin into the country using a network of corrupt customs agents and airport workers. Lucas, once a criminal mastermind, was now reduced to a defendant in the courtroom, facing a long prison sentence for his crimes. In 1976, Lucas was sentenced to 70 years in prison for drug trafficking, murder, and racketeering. However, in a surprising twist, he cooperated with law enforcement and became a government informant. In exchange for his cooperation, Lucas's sentence was drastically reduced, and he served only 10 years in prison before being released in the early 1980s. Despite his cooperation, Lucas struggled to adjust to life after prison. The FBI's deal with him left a stain on his reputation, and his former allies saw his cooperation as a betrayal. After his release, Lucas attempted to live a quiet life away from crime. He moved to Atlanta, Georgia, and attempted to distance himself from his past. However, the damage had already been done. The legacy of Frank Lucas was forever tied to his role in the American drug epidemic, particularly the heroin crisis that ravaged Harlem and other parts of the U.S. during the 1970s. His impact on the world of organized crime was undeniable, but his fall from grace and cooperation with the government left him with few allies. Lucas died in 2019 at the age of 88 after living out his final years in relative obscurity. His death marked the end of the life of one of the most notorious drug lords in American history. Though he had been convicted for his crimes, his life, which had been filled with so much ambition and violence, ultimately ended with a compromise of integrity and an uneasy relationship with the government. Frank Lucas's rise and fall stand as a reminder of the dangers of the drug trade and the inevitable consequences of betrayal in a world governed by greed, violence, and ambition. Paul "Big Paulie" Castellano was the head of the Gambino crime family during one of the most turbulent periods in the history of New York's mafia. His reign as boss was marked by a blend of ambition, business acumen, and ultimately betrayal. While he may not have been the most violent or publicized mob boss, his ambition to solidify control over New York's mafia scene would lead to one of the most infamous acts of violence in mafia history, the assassination that set the stage for John Gotti's rise to power. Born in 1903 in Brooklyn, New York, Castellano was the son of Italian immigrants. He grew up in a world steeped in crime, and like many of his peers, he was drawn into the underworld at a young age. By the 1930s, Castellano had gained the trust of Carlo Gambino, the boss of the powerful Gambino crime family, and became involved in several profitable ventures, including extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, and drug trafficking. Castellano's business-minded approach made him one of Gambino's most trusted lieutenants. In 1976, after the death of Carlo Gambino, Castellano took over the leadership of the Gambino crime family. He inherited one of the most powerful mafia organizations in New York, but his leadership was markedly different from Gambino's. Whereas Gambino had built his power through a mix of subtlety, political connections, and control, Castellano sought to modernize the family's operations. He favored a more business-oriented approach, expanding into legitimate industries like construction, garbage collection, and real estate, while still running the family's illegal operations with efficiency. However, Castellano's focus on business and his attempts to distance the Gambino family from street-level violence alienated many of his underlings. Castellano's leadership was marked by his aloofness and lack of interaction with the lower levels of the family. His preference for conducting mafia business through intermediaries caused dissatisfaction among some of his more violent associates, who felt sidelined in the family's operations. This dissatisfaction began to grow, especially among those who believed that the family should be more involved in traditional mafia activities, such as racketeering and robbery. The growing tensions between Castellano and his inner circle reached a boiling point in 1985, when the Gambino family faced a split over Castellano's leadership. One of the most vocal critics of Castellano's reign was John Gotti, a rising star in the family who believed that Castellano's focus on legitimate business was weakening the family's power. Gotti, who was known for his street-savvy, ruthlessness and charisma, had grown frustrated with Castellano's refusal to engage in the violent, street-level activities that made the family wealthy and feared. Gotti's growing influence, combined with his desire for control, made him the perfect candidate to challenge Castellano's leadership. In December 1985, the conflict came to a head when Castellano was gunned down in a brazen hit outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. Castellano, who had been heading to dinner at the restaurant, was shot multiple times in a public assassination that sent shockwaves through the mafia world. The hit was orchestrated by Gotti, who had grown tired of Castellano's leadership and saw an opportunity to take control of the family. Gotti, along with several of his allies, had plotted the assassination, ensuring that Castellano's reign would end in violent fashion. The assassination of Paul Castellano was a turning point in the history of the Gambino family. Gotti's rise to power was swift and dramatic, and he quickly took control of the family, moving from underboss to boss. Gotti's ability to eliminate his rivals with such precision made him a formidable force in the underworld. He brought a more aggressive, violent approach to the family's operations, focusing on traditional mafia rackets like drug trafficking, money laundering, and illegal gambling. Gotti's public persona and flashy lifestyle earned him the nickname the Teflon Don, as he managed to evade multiple convictions despite overwhelming evidence against him. However, despite his rise to power, Gotti's reign was not without its challenges. His increasing public visibility and defiance of the mafia code of silence led to growing tensions within the five families. Gotti's willingness to flaunt his power and take risks alienated many of his allies, and his public persona made him a target for law enforcement. Ultimately, Gotti's publicity-seeking behavior, his involvement in high-profile murders, and his failure to adhere to the traditional codes of silence within the mafia would lead to his conviction in 1992, largely due to the testimony of his underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano, who turned state's witness against him. Paul Castellano's death marked the end of an era for the Gambino crime family and the mafia as a whole. His assassination, while motivated by personal and professional rivalries, also symbolized the changing dynamics within organized crime. The Gambino family, once known for its more subtle, business-oriented approach under Castellano, would now be led by a more ruthless, violent figure in Gotti, who would go on to become one of the most famous mob bosses in history. The violence surrounding Castellano's death was a reminder of the constant power struggles and betrayals that define the mafia world, where loyalty is fleeting and betrayal is often rewarded with murder. Castellano's legacy remains complex. While he was responsible for modernizing the Gambino family's operations and expanding its influence into legitimate industries, his inability to keep the peace within the family and his failure to maintain the loyalty of his men ultimately led to his downfall. Castellano's death also marked the end of an era for the New York Mafia. as it transitioned from the more business-minded operations of the 1970s and 1980s to the more violent, media-driven world that Gotti would dominate. The assassination of Paul Castellano was a moment that reshaped the underworld of organized crime, and it left a lasting impact on the Gambino family and the mafia at large. His death stands as a reminder that even the most powerful figures in the mafia can be brought down by ambition, betrayal, and violence, and that in the world of organized crime, there are few certainties, except for the inevitable consequences of breaking the code of silence. Joey Gallo, known as the Clown, was one of the most colorful and controversial figures in the world of organized crime. His story is a tragic and turbulent tale of ambition, betrayal, and ruthless violence. Unlike other mobsters who kept a low profile, Gallo was known for his flamboyant personality, his public persona, and his defiance of the traditional mafia code. His rise to power within the Colombo crime family was marked by conflict with other factions, internal power struggles, and a reckless disregard for the rules of the mafia, all of which eventually led to his tragic and violent end. Born in Brooklyn, New York in 1930, Gallo grew up in a working-class family. He was introduced to crime at an early age, and like many others in his neighborhood, he was drawn to the mafia. Gallo quickly established himself as a brash, ambitious figure who was willing to do whatever it took to climb the ranks of the underworld. He became involved in petty crime before joining the Colombo family in his early 20s. It was during this time that Gallo's ruthlessness and violent tendencies began to emerge. The turning point in Gallo's career came when he became involved in a power struggle with the leadership of the Colombo family. Gallo, along with his brothers Albert and Martin, began to challenge the authority of the family's boss, Joseph Colombo, who had taken control of the family in the 1960s. Gallo, who had been involved in several profitable operations, felt that he was being held back by Colombo's leadership style. He believed that Colombo's focus on maintaining a low profile and avoiding violence was limiting the family's potential. In 1971, the tension between Gallo and Colombo reached a boiling point. Gallo, who had grown frustrated with Colombo's leadership, orchestrated a botched assassination attempt on Colombo. The attack took place at a rally for the Italian-American Civil Rights League, which Colombo had founded. The assassination attempt, however, failed. Colombo was wounded, but survived the attack. The incident set off a violent and bloody war within the Colombo family, with Gallo and his supporters pitted against Colombo's loyalists. The Gallo-Colombo War raged for several years, and Gallo's actions attracted significant attention from both the FBI and rival mafia families. The violence between the factions within the Colombo family threatened to destabilize the entire mafia structure in New York. Gallo, whose reputation for violence and defiance grew, became a marked man. His willingness to publicly defy the mafia code and his openly antagonistic relationship with the family's leadership made him a target for both law enforcement and other mobsters. In 1972, Gallo was arrested for murder, racketeering, and several other crimes, but he was released on bail due to his connections within the mafia. Despite his legal troubles, Gallo remained a powerful figure within the criminal world. However, his growing reputation as a wild card and his willingness to challenge the leadership of his own family made him a liability to some of the more established figures within the mafia. By the mid-1970s, Gallo's influence within the Colombo family was diminishing. In 1976, Gallo was lured to a meeting at a restaurant in Manhattan, where he was ambushed and shot dead. The assassination was carried out by a group of men loyal to Colombo. It was a betrayal that shocked the mafia world, as Gallo had once been one of the family's most prominent and feared members. His murder was seen as a direct response to his challenge of Colombo's authority and his refusal to follow the traditional mafia code. Gallo's assassination was not just the end of his life, but also the end of an era for the Colombo crime family. His death marked the conclusion of a bloody feud that had consumed the family for years. Joseph Colombo would go on to lose much of his influence within the family as well, and the family would eventually be taken over by Carmine Persico in the late 1970s. The murder of Joey Gallo marked a pivotal moment in the history of organized crime in New York. His rise and fall were a reflection of the changing dynamics within the mafia, where loyalty was often replaced by greed and ambition could quickly turn into betrayal. Gallo's personality, his flamboyant style, and his willingness to defy the code that governed the mafia ultimately led to his violent death. His story is one of both triumph and tragedy, a reminder of how ambition and violence can shape the rise of a mobster, and how those same qualities can lead to their undoing. Despite his violent death, Gallo's legacy lives on as a symbol of the reckless ambition and brutality that defined the mafia in its heyday. His rise through the ranks of the Colombo family, his defiance of the mafia code, and his violent fall from grace serve as a cautionary tale of the cost of seeking power at any cost. Joey Gallo may have been a mobster who wanted it all, but in the end, it was his ambition and willingness to betray his family that led to his untimely death, leaving behind a legacy of violence, betrayal, and loss. James Whitey Bulger's name is infamous in the annals of organized crime. Known for his violent tactics and his double life as an informant for the FBI, Bulger became one of the most wanted criminals in American history. His rise to power within the Winter Hill Gang in Boston, his involvement in a vast array of criminal activities, and his eventual betrayal of his criminal associates and the law enforcement system he was supposed to be working for made him a deeply controversial and feared figure. Bulger's life story is a brutal reminder of the danger of betrayal, the corruption within the criminal justice system, and the violent consequences of playing both sides of the law. Born in 1929 in Boston, Bulger grew up in the working-class neighborhoods of the city's South Boston area. He was the son of Irish immigrants and, like many young men in his neighborhood, was drawn to a life of crime. Bulger's early criminal activities included petty theft and hustling, but his rise to prominence began when he joined the Winter Hill Gang, a group involved in extortion, loan sharking, gambling, and drug trafficking. Bulger quickly became known for his violent nature and his ability to dominate his rivals. He became a feared figure in the Boston underworld, using intimidation and ruthlessness to build his criminal empire. In the early 1970s, Bulger's criminal activities took a new turn when he began to cooperate with the FBI. In exchange for information about rival mafia operations, Bulger became an informant, providing the FBI with intelligence about Italian mafia operations in the region. This partnership allowed Bulger to operate with impunity while maintaining his control over the Winter Hill Gang. For years, he was able to avoid prosecution, even as he continued to engage in violent criminal activities. His cooperation with the FBI gave him access to valuable intelligence about law enforcement investigations into his activities, allowing him to stay one step ahead of the authorities. However, Bulger's relationship with the FBI was fraught with corruption. While the FBI viewed him as a valuable source of information, they failed to recognize the extent to which Bulger was using his informant status to manipulate law enforcement. Bulger was not just providing information, he was also using the FBI's protection to eliminate rivals and expand his influence. His ability to operate without fear of arrest allowed him to continue his involvement in murder, drug trafficking, racketeering, and other illegal enterprises. Over time, his control over the South Boston area grew, and he became one of the most powerful criminal figures in the city. Despite his growing power, Bulger's greed and ambition eventually led to his downfall. As he expanded his empire, he began to push against the limits of his cooperation with the FBI. His control over South Boston and his violent tactics eventually made him a target for both rival gangs and law enforcement. Bulger's influence within the Winter Hill Gang also led to internal strife, as some members of the gang grew dissatisfied with his leadership. Bulger's reputation as a violent and unpredictable figure began to alienate those who had once supported him. The FBI's failure to act on Bulger's increasing violence and the corruption within the agency's relationship with him allowed his criminal activities to continue for years. However, in the 1990s, the FBI's focus began to shift, and they started investigating the agency's ties to Bulger. In 1994, the FBI finally began to unravel the extent of Bulger's manipulation and his involvement in organized crime. At the same time, Bulger's rivalries within the mafia world and his increasing paranoia led him to make a fatal decision. In 1995, Bulger fled Boston after being tipped off about an impending indictment. He went into hiding, living a life on the run for over a decade. For years, Bulger's whereabouts remained unknown, and the FBI launched an extensive manhunt to capture him. He was eventually placed on the 10 most wanted fugitives list, and his capture became one of the most highly publicized searches in American law enforcement history. Despite his high profile, Bulger was able to stay hidden for years, using fake identities and connections in the criminal underworld to evade capture. In 2011, after more than 16 years in hiding, Bulger was captured in Santa Monica, California. His arrest was a significant moment in the history of organized crime, as it marked the end of one of the most notorious and elusive criminals in American history. Bulger's capture was the result of a combination of federal agents, intelligence, and tips from the public. His arrest revealed the full extent of his crimes, including his role in 19 murders and his involvement in a wide range of drug trafficking, racketeering, and extortion schemes. After his capture, Bulger was tried and convicted on multiple charges, including murder, racketeering, and conspiracy. In 2013, he was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison, plus 5 years, for his role in the murders and the vast criminal empire he had built. His trial exposed the depths of corruption and manipulation that allowed him to evade justice for so many years. Bulger's cooperation with the FBI, combined with his ability to control his criminal network, had allowed him to operate unchecked for decades, and his arrest marked the final chapter in his violent and deceptive life. In 2018, while serving his sentence in West Virginia, Bulger was found dead in his cell under mysterious circumstances. It is believed that he was beaten to death by fellow inmates, likely in retaliation for his role in betraying the Winter Hill Gang and his dealings with the FBI. His death was a fitting end to a man who had lived his life by betrayal, manipulation, and violence. Frank Bulger's story is one of ambition gone wrong, of a man who played both sides of the law, ultimately finding that the cost of betrayal is high, and in the world of organized crime, there is no such thing as loyalty when power is at stake. His rise to prominence and his ability to evade capture for so long made him a symbol of the dangers and corruption within the world of organized crime. His downfall, when it came, was swift and violent, as he was ultimately undone by his own double life, and his legacy will forever be tied to his role in one of the most infamous and controversial federal investigations in mafia history. The world of organized crime, particularly the mafia, has been a fascinating and deadly spectacle, rife with violence, betrayal, and power struggles. The stories of mobsters such as John Gotti, Vito Genovese, Tony Spilotro, Frank Lucas, and many others serve as grim reminders of how ambition, loyalty, and treachery are all intertwined in the cutthroat underworld of the American mafia. These figures, from the infamous Teflon Don Gotti to the calculating and violent Sammy the Bull Gravano, left behind legacies that continue to intrigue and captivate those interested in the criminal world. John Gotti's rise to power, marked by the assassination of Paul Castellano and his subsequent reign over the Gambino family, epitomized the idea of a public mob boss, someone who refused to follow the old mafia rules of secrecy and subtlety. His charismatic personality and flashy lifestyle made him a media sensation, and for a time, he was untouchable, winning acquittals in court cases where the evidence against him seemed irrefutable. His eventual downfall came not from law enforcement, but from his own ambition and his public exposure, which alienated allies and attracted too much attention. Gotti's eventual conviction and life sentence marked the end of the era where a mob boss could hold public sway and remain untouchable by the law. Then there's Sammy Gravano, Gotti's once loyal underboss, whose decision to turn state's witness was as much a betrayal as it was a lifeline. Gravano's testimony helped the FBI bring down John Gotti, which left a dark stain on the mafia's code of silence, the omerta. By breaking the vow of loyalty to Gotti and his criminal family, Gravano demonstrated that, in the mafia world, even the strongest allegiances are fragile when self-preservation becomes a priority. Gravano's deal with the authorities spared him from the prison sentence he would have otherwise faced and placed him in the witness protection program, but his name, like many other mobsters, remains forever linked to betrayal. The stories of Frank Lucas, a Harlem drug lord who pioneered the direct importation of heroin from Southeast Asia, and Tony Spilotro, a brutal enforcer for the Chicago outfit with violent tendencies, serve as contrasting examples of ambition and power within the mafia. Lucas built his criminal empire using strategy and smarts, cutting out the middleman and providing a purer product which allowed him to rise quickly. Spilotro, on the other hand, led through sheer brutality, serving as an enforcer who terrorized rivals and earned his position through violence and intimidation. Both figures were involved in highly profitable criminal rackets, but ultimately met tragic ends as their ambition made them too dangerous and too visible. Lucas's fall came when the FBI launched an extensive investigation into his heroin network, which led to his capture and eventual cooperation with authorities. His story, like Gotti's, underscores the perils of criminal ambition. While Lucas tried to distance himself from the public eye, his eventual involvement in a federal investigation led to his imprisonment. And despite his cooperation in exchange for a reduced sentence, Lucas never returned to the power he once held. Spilotro, on the other hand, disappeared after being murdered in a gangland hit. His loyalty to the Chicago outfit ultimately led him to be betrayed by those who saw him as too much of a liability, a fatal trait for any mobster in the world of organized crime. The mafia world, and indeed the world of organized crime at large, revolves around the delicate balance of power, loyalty, and betrayal. The mobsters whose stories have been chronicled here were all marked by their violent tendencies and their drive to control the criminal enterprises they ran. They faced betrayal by their own associates, were often outsmarted by law enforcement, and were eventually undone by their own greed or the arrogance of believing they could outlast the laws of the underworld. In many ways, their stories mirror each other. Each mobster, Gotti, Gravano, Spilotro, Lucas and Anastasia, among others, found success and power through brutality, strategic alliances and an unwavering desire to dominate their worlds. Yet, in the end, they all faced downfalls that served as powerful reminders of the mafia's inherent volatility. The price of power in the criminal underworld is steep, and in each of these stories, that price was paid with either their freedom or their lives. Even those who seemingly escape justice, like Frank Lucas, are left haunted by the moral and ethical costs of their actions. Though Lucas cooperated with the government, the ramifications of his actions, contributing to a national heroin epidemic, leave a dark legacy that even his cooperation cannot erase. Others, like Sammy Gravano, may walk free, but they remain forever defined by their actions and the reputations they built through betrayal. In the end, the stories of these men reveal a complex world where loyalty is constantly tested, where the only certainty is betrayal, and where power is held only by those who can survive the constant backstabbing and violence that defines mafia life. While many of them are now legends in their own right, their rise and falls leave behind a cautionary tale for all those who seek power in the shadowy world of organized crime. This series of 100 disturbing mafia stories has taken us through the rise and fall of some of the most infamous mobsters in history, shedding light on the inner workings of organized crime and exposing the violent truths that lie at the heart of the mafia. As their stories conclude, we are reminded that in the world of the mafia, loyalty and betrayal are never far apart. And no matter how powerful or untouchable a boss may seem, their empire will crumble, often at the hands of those they trust most.